Welcome to Sleepy Owl. To understand the true beginning, we must look past the first chipped rock. We must look to a change in the world itself and in the posture of the creatures within it. Long before tools, there was a great shifting. Much of Africa, some 7 million years in the past, was a realm of deep, humid forest. But the earth is never still. Tectonic forces began to pull the eastern part of the continent apart, creating vast rift valleys, lifting highlands, and redirecting ancient rivers. The climate, once uniformly wet, became a patchwork. In some regions, the dense canopy began to fray at the edges. Forests fragmented, giving way to mosaics, open grasslands brushing against woodland, clearings appearing where once there was only shade. It was in these unstable, in-between places that a subtle advantage began to matter. The ability to rise up on 2 feet. Not for marathon walks, not yet, but just enough to free the hands for a moment, to peer over the tall, golden grasses, to move efficiently between islands of trees and patches of food. This was not a destined path. It was a practical response, a physical compromise forged by a changing environment. In this setting, we meet the earliest shadows of our lineage. Sahelanthropus, from what is now Chad, lived around that distant 7 million year mark. Its skull hints at a creature in transition, with a flatter face and smaller canines than its ape cousins. Most tellingly, the opening where the spinal cord meets the skull suggests a head balanced more like a walker's than a climber's. The evidence is a whisper, not a shout, and debate continues. Slightly later, around 6 million years ago in Kenya, Ororan tugenensis appears. A fragment of its thigh bone carries signs of bearing weight upright, hinting at a life split between the trees and the emerging ground below. Then comes Ardipithecus, particularly Ardi, from about 4.4 million years ago. Her remarkably preserved skeleton paints a vivid portrait of an ancestor caught between worlds. She possessed a grasping big toe for climbing, yet her pelvis and legs were structured for bipedal movement when necessary. She was neither chimpanzee nor human, but something beautifully intermediate, a creature adapting to the forest above and the savanna below, a master of the borderland. By 4 million years ago, this trend solidifies with Australopithecus. Australopithecus anamensis walked more consistently on 2 legs. Its teeth, worn by tougher, grittier foods from open environments, tell of a life increasingly lived on the ground. Then, shortly after, comes the famous Australopithecus afarensis, an individual you may know as Lucy. She represents a pivotal moment. Not a tool maker, not a fire user, but a walker. A successful survivor of a planet in flux. The East African Rift Valley had become a corridor of evolutionary pressure, shaped by volcano, drought, and predator. Here, survival favored not brute strength or speed, but versatility. Walking upright was a compromise, a way to see over the grass without abandoning the safety of trees, a way to carry an infant, a prized find, a memory, while still being ready to flee. But Africa's gift was not just its shifting terrain. It was its relentless complexity. These ancient landscapes demanded problem-solving. They created distance between resources, requiring foresight and memory. They presented seasonal shortages, demanding dietary flexibility. And perhaps, quietly, they fostered the seeds of social negotiation, the kind of mental adaptation that would later flower into culture, but which began as the simple, constant challenge of staying alive in a world that refused to stay the same. We cannot know what these beings felt or thought. We cannot ask if they sensed their own uniqueness. But we know this: the decision to walk upright altered everything. It changed the curve of the spine, the balance of the pelvis, the mechanics of the legs. It set the stage for a slower gut and an expanding mind, a trade-off that would unfold over millions of years. But at this point, none of that was certain. These apes were not inventors or artists. They were not yet Homo. But they were walking. And the earth, silently, was watching. Consider this. For every ancestor whose line led to us, countless others faded into the deep silence of time. The fossil record from this epoch is sparse. A tooth here, a fragment of femur there, a partial skull. From these fragile clues, we piece together gate and possibility, but never certainty. And that is the humility of this science. We can analyze bone density and model biomechanics, but we cannot ask a 4-million-year-old skeleton if it dreamed. What came before the Stone Age was not an emptiness. It was a slow, physical rehearsal. A body learning a new way to be in the world. Not modern, not human, but walking, balancing, adapting. In that persistent movement lay the invisible groundwork for all that would follow. Fire, language, memory, the very concept of a past. So the haunting question shifts. It's not merely why we began making tools, but why we were shaped with the potential to do so. What kind of world turns an ape into an ancestor? The answer may be hidden not in what we eventually built, but in how we moved long before we built anything at all. There is a peculiar magic to a fractured stone. If you saw one today, you might assume it was broken by weather or chance. But roughly 3.3 million years ago, on the shores of an ancient lake in what is now Kenya, a river cobble was struck. A sharp flake sliced clean away. And someone, or something, noticed. Not just the sound, but the result. An edge. A cutting line. A difference. And in that difference, something in the world quietly shifted. This was not the first time a primate used a rock. Many creatures do. Capuchin monkeys crack nuts. Sea otters smash shells on their chests. But this was different. This was not about using an object as it was found. This was about deliberately altering its very form, creating something new from something old. We do not know the name or even the species of the being who did it. The site, Lomekwi, dates to a time before our own genus, Homo, clearly existed. Only Australopithecines and perhaps the enigmatic Kenyanthropus roamed the area. If these earlier, smaller-brained cousins made these tools, it changes the narrative profoundly. It means the idea of tool-making emerged before humanity as we define it. The Lomekwian tools are crude by later standards, heavy cores, sharp flakes, stone anvils. But they are not random. The angles of impact, the patterns of fracture, speak of repeated, deliberate strikes. Someone learned that a certain gesture, a specific angle of force, could yield a functional edge. This was not instinct. It was a primitive technique, a spark of applied physics. What was the edge for? At nearby sites of similar age, we find butchered animal bones. Long limbs marked with cut marks, shattered for marrow. This suggests access to a rich, sealed-away calorie source. Meat and fat behind thick hide. This was likely not hunting, but opportunistic scavenging, waiting for large predators to finish their meal, then moving in to carefully salvage what remained. But with a sharp stone flake, that salvage became precise. A keen edge could strip flesh faster than teeth or claws. A modest advantage, but over millennia, such advantages compound. By 2.6 million years ago, the pattern grows clearer, more refined. At places like Gunna in Ethiopia, a new style emerges. These are the first Oldowan tools. They are smaller, more efficient, and show clearer standardization. The technique is unmistakably intentional. Flakes are struck with purpose, edges are used, then resharpened. Some tools were carried kilometers from their source, a clue to foresight. The creatures behind them were no longer just reacting. They were preparing. Who were they? The fossil evidence suggests early Homo, like Homo habilis, handyman. But the link is not always perfect. Bones and stones are rarely found in indisputable partnership. What is undeniable is the cognitive leap. This was no longer opportunistic rock-breaking. This was a technology. The genius wasn't just in the sharpness of the flint, but in the sharpness of the mind. It required an understanding of geometry and fracture mechanics, an ability to hold a mental template of the desired outcome, and the patience to execute it. That knowledge then had to be shared, mimicked, passed down. It is possible the first true human culture was not spoken language or art, but the silent, skilled craft of flaking stone. Imagine the cognitive load. You must select the right stone, understand its internal structure, position it precisely, apply controlled force, and then repeat the process until a functional tool emerges. It is a deep, nonverbal intelligence, an intelligence of hands, of pressure, of cause and effect. This is the foundational intelligence upon which all else would be built. Yet, for all its innovation, the Oldowan toolkit remained simple for over 1,000,000 years, mostly cores, flakes, and choppers. To our modern minds, accustomed to relentless novelty, this looks like stagnation. But that is our bias. In reality, it may represent a perfect, stable solution. A technology that did exactly what was needed in the environments of its time. Most early sites cluster in East Africa's Rift Valley. This is no accident. The rifting process exposed stone and preserved traces, but it also created the very mosaic landscapes that demanded flexibility. In a world of overlapping forests and grasslands, a simple stone tool was a multi-purpose key for butchering, digging, cracking, scraping. The tools did more than aid survival. They began to shape the toolmaker. Neural pathways for fine grip, hand-eye coordination, and sequential planning likely expanded with each generation that learned the craft. Tool use and brain development entered a slow dance, each influencing the other over countless generations. But let's not romanticize. These were not philosophers. They were scavengers, opportunists, clever apes with a new trick. Yet within that trick lay the seed of everything to come. A small, deliberate act of fracture that made the world a little less random, that turned chance into choice. And so we are left to wonder, what if that first flake had never flown? What if the mind behind it had simply walked away? Would the world have waited another 1,000,000 years for the edge to appear? Or would it never have come at all? What does it truly mean to be human? We often push that question into philosophy. But the answer began to take physical form between 2.5 and 1.9 million years ago. It was a change so gradual you'd have missed it in a lifetime, visible only in the layers of sediment, in the scatter of bones and the sudden evidence of more capable hands. Not a leap, but a slow becoming. The emergence of a creature that would later name itself Homo. It is tempting to point to Homo habilis as the first of us. The name itself, meaning handyman, is a story we imposed after the fact. When Louis Leakey and his team unveiled the fossils in the 1960s, they proposed a powerful idea. Humanity began not with a big brain or speech, but with craft. Yet Homo habilis was a mosaic. Its brain, around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters, was larger than any Australopithecine but far from modern. Its face still projected, its arms were long and strong. But the hands tell a quieter tale. The fingers were more curved than ours, yet the thumb was stronger, the fingertips broader, capable of a precision grip. The simple Oldowan tools found nearby may not scream genius, but they whisper intent. The landscape of Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania remains a rich archive of this transition. Here, habilis fossils lie amid stone flakes and the bones of large animals, antelope, zebra, even elephants. Many bones bear cut marks that sometimes cross over the tooth marks of large carnivores. This overlapping evidence has fueled a long debate. Were these early humans hunters or cunning scavengers? The truth likely lies in a flexible, opportunistic intelligence. Some bones show deliberate smashing for marrow, suggesting an understanding of sequence, that inside a hard shell lay something rich and vital. That nutritional richness mattered immensely. Meat is calorie-dense, packed with nutrients critical for supporting metabolically expensive tissue, the brain. Around this same period, the cranial capacity of early Homo begins a slow, steady climb. This was no accident. A feedback loop was born. Better tools provided better access to high-quality food. Better food supported the growth and maintenance of larger brains. Larger brains enabled the conception of better tools. It was a virtuous, ratcheting spiral not toward dominance, but toward greater complexity. Homo habilis did not have the stage to itself. Another form appears in the fossil record around the same time, Homo rudolfensis, with a flatter face, larger teeth, and a brain that may have reached 750 cubic centimeters. Were they separate species, or just regional variants of the same evolving lineage? The debate continues, but the message is clear. This was not the clean, singular march of a chosen species. It was an evolutionary experiment, with multiple branches testing different strategies in the same challenging world. Sites in Kenya's Kubifora region add depth to this picture. Here, clusters of tools and butchered bones suggest a more persistent, planned presence. Sometimes, tools are found far from any source of raw stone. This act of transport is quietly revolutionary. It implies foresight, the mental capacity to carry a useful object for future use in a different place. It requires an internal map, a memory of landscapes, and a projection of future need. More subtle still are the hints of social life. Efficient butchery suggests shared knowledge. The presence of multiple individuals at sites hints at cooperation. Navigating a landscape full of predators with nothing but sharp stones and wits would have demanded a level of social cohesion we can scarcely grasp. Was there proto-language? Probably. Were they naming things, planning, or simply sharing emotion? Fear, excitement, urgency, through tone and gesture? We cannot know. And that is the point. Science holds the space for that mystery, reminding us how much of becoming human is written in whispers, not shouts. The Rift Valley itself was the crucible. Tectonic shifts created lakes and exposed resources. Volcanic ash fell, preserving moments in time like a geological snapshot. The patchwork of grasslands, brush, and woodland margins provided the perfect selective pressure for versatility. In this instability, the winners were not specialists, but generalists, creatures with good hands, decent memory, and a willingness to adapt. That adaptability might be the most human trait of all. By the end of this pivotal period, something irreversible had occurred. We were still small, still scattered, still confined to a few African valleys. But we had crossed a cognitive and behavioral threshold. We had begun to shape the external world with deliberate intention. And once that process starts, it does not stop. Each flake broken from a core, each bone stripped a little cleaner, each technique passed on through gesture or grunt. This was the true revolution. It just didn't look like one at the time. So, what makes a human enough? Is it brain size, grip strength, a taste for marrow? Perhaps it's none of those things alone. Perhaps it's the moment a conscious mind connects an action with an outcome, and then chooses to repeat it, to refine it, to share it. It's the moment a primate breaks a rock and something shifts not just in the stone, but in the consciousness that broke it. Not everywhere, not all at once, but just enough to begin the long, patient rehearsal for everything that would follow. Becoming human was never about being finished. It was about being perpetually, inevitably, unfinished. How did a creature born of African savannas end up walking into the vastness of Asia? It wasn't destiny, nor curiosity as we know it. There were no maps, no grand plans. Just feet walking, one valley after another. But sometime between 1.9 and 1.2 million years ago, a new kind of human emerged, one that didn't just adapt to its environment, but moved far beyond it. In doing so, it transformed. It became taller, leaner, more enduring. This was Homo erectus. And it was the first of our kind to leave the continent of our collective birth. Homo erectus enters the record with a new kind of confidence. The earliest fossils from East Africa reveal a skeleton rebuilt for distance. The limbs were longer, more proportioned like ours. The pelvis was narrower, more efficient for a striding gait. The feet were fully arched, shock-absorbent. This was not the somewhat awkward bipedalism of earlier hominins. This was a body engineered for endurance travel. Erectus didn't sprint across continents. It simply, persistently, did not stop walking. The brain was larger too, often approaching 900 cubic centimeters early on and eventually surpassing 1,000. But this intelligence wasn't just for abstract thought. It was for coordination, for memory, for solving the novel problems of new lands, different animals, unfamiliar plants, colder nights, thinner air. Erectus didn't invent complex new technologies for each challenge. It survived through sheer resilience. And survival on that scale, across such space and time, is its own profound form of genius. One of the most telling sights is not in Africa, but in Dmanisi, in the nation of Georgia. Here, in layers about 1.8 million years old, researchers found something remarkable, not just a skull, but nearly complete skeletons of several individuals. The Dmanisi hominins had surprisingly small brains for Erectus, some as low as 600 cubic centimeters, but they possessed the same tall, travel-ready body plan. And they carried with them simple stone tools, akin to the Oldowan kits of Africa. This was no triumphant, technologically advanced invasion. It was a quiet, persistent expansion. The message of Dmanisi is profound. Leaving Africa didn't require a breakthrough in complexity. It required sheer, stubborn capacity. The capacity to endure, to adapt, and to keep moving into the unknown. From Georgia, the trail of footprints, both literal and metaphorical, stretches eastward. Far to the east, in northern China, at a site called Nyawan Basin, unmistakably modified stone flakes have been found, dating back at least 1.6 million years. Further south, on the island of Java in Indonesia, Homo erectus fossils appear in layers over 1.5 million years old. How did they arrive there? Likely by generations of gradual movement across what was then a vast, exposed continental shelf called Sundaland, a journey of island hopping made possible by lower sea levels. This was not a single, heroic expedition. It was the slow, demographic creep of a species, following rivers, tracking game, cresting hills that no human had ever seen before. The tools they carried remained simple, mostly flakes and choppers, Oldowan in spirit. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden revolutions in design. But they worked. In places like China's Bose Basin, hammerstones and anvils have been found alongside butchered animal bones, suggesting that Homo erectus wasn't just passing through. It was settling in, processing resources, perhaps even thriving in these new worlds. The climate of this early Pleistocene epoch offered a helping hand. As African grasslands expanded and contracted, they opened new corridors north into the Levant and eastward across Asia. Forests receded in places, leaving a patchwork of environments. Into this varied mosaic stepped a generalist, a species that could handle both sun-baked plains and shaded woodlands. Homo erectus didn't need a single, perfect niche. It could make do with many. A hauntingly direct reminder of this expansion isn't a fossil, but a footprint. In northern Kenya, at a place called Illirit, a series of tracks were preserved in hardened mud. These aren't the tentative, splayed prints of earlier hominins. To the untrained eye, they look like they could have been made yesterday. Aligned toes, a clear arch, a confident, striding gait. They were left by Homo erectus nearly 1.5 million years ago. They show more than movement. They show direction and purpose. But why leave? Not for conquest or a conscious sense of exploration. The expansion was likely ecological, a slow-motion following of shifting resources. As animal herds migrated, as water sources changed, as plant distributions altered, the groups with the capacity to follow them were the ones who persisted. Some stayed, some left. It was not a heroic journey, but a demographic one. And those who left their mark across half the planet. Mysteries remain. Why do Homo erectus skulls from Java, China, and Georgia show such variability in brain size and features? Were there multiple, regionally distinct populations? Is Homo erectus even a single label, or does it contain a multitude of experiments? Some researchers argue for subspecies, others see deeper splits. But whatever taxonomic boxes we use, the overarching pattern holds. By 1.2 million years ago, humans had achieved something no primate ever had. We had become a global species. This was not a story of linear progress. There were clear limits. The toolkits remained basic for nearly another million years. There's little widespread evidence for built shelters or organized, large-scale hunting. Social life existed, certainly, but it left few traces we can interpret. Yet the fundamental revolution had already happened. The shape of the world had changed, not geologically, but biologically. It now contained humans in motion. Not in one ecosystem, in one form, but scattered across continents. This raises a deeper, more philosophical question. When Homo erectus walked into the valleys of China, was it still the same creature that left Africa? Or had the journey itself already begun to transform it, physically and perhaps mentally? Are the boundaries between species real, solid lines, or just the temporary names we give to things caught in the endless, flowing process of change? Every footfall into a new valley was an experiment. Every generation born far from the Rift Valley carried a slightly different map in its bones, written not on parchment, but in its very physiology. We are often told, correctly, that humanity was born in Africa. But it is equally true that humanity was born again in Georgia, in China, in Java. Not because the species magically transformed anew in each place, but because the context, the challenges, the landscapes, the pressures, did. And as the bones of Homo erectus lie scattered from the shores of the Black Sea to the equatorial jungles of Indonesia, they whisper a quiet, humbling truth. We are not from one place. We are from many. We are the descendants of a species that once walked into the utter unknown without realizing it was doing anything remarkable. The journey was not about a destination. It was about continuation. And perhaps, in that relentless forward motion, we find a core element of what it means to be human. To keep moving even when you don't know what you'll find, to leave the warmth of the familiar simply because the path ahead is open and your legs are strong. Why would a species with no written language, no centralized power, spend over 1 million years perfecting the shape of a stone teardrop? The Acheulean hand axe is one of the most persistent, widespread objects in the entire human story. First appearing around 1.8 million years ago and continuing with remarkable consistency for well over 1 million years, these tools are so ubiquitous and standardized that archaeologists see them as the first true artifact of deliberate design. From the banks of the Thames in England to the plains of the Rift Valley, from India to the Iberian Peninsula, the hand axe is there, symmetrical, pointed, and unmistakably crafted. What makes it even more fascinating is this. For an unimaginably long stretch of time, it changed very little. To understand the hand axe is to witness a shift in consciousness. The Acheulean tradition followed the Oldowan, but it demanded something new, planning. Shaping a good hand axe isn't about random bashing. It's about holding a three-dimensional form in your mind before the first strike. You must see the finished shape within the unworked stone. That mental capacity alone marks a significant leap. The maker could conceive of a pattern, an ideal, and then patiently bring it into reality. The earliest examples from East Africa are rougher, larger, and less standardized. But over time, across immense distances, the shape begins to converge. By about 1.2 million years ago, from Africa to Europe, we see hand axes with a consistent, elegant outline, an oval base tapering to a point, thinned by meticulous flaking on both sides, exhibiting a careful, often beautiful, symmetry. This wasn't random. It looks like a tradition, a shared idea of the right way to make a tool. Most scholars associate the Acheulean with Homo erectus and later, other robust Homo species. Whoever the makers were, they seemed to agree, across hundreds of thousands of years and thousands of miles, on this form. This leads to one of the most haunting mysteries of this technology. The hand axe spread across the old world, yet its basic design saw staggering conservation, not innovation. Imagine a single type of object, a design, being passed from mentor to learner, from generation to generation, for over 1 million years. In our modern age of relentless obsolescence, such continuity feels almost impossible. Why did it last so long? One straightforward answer is that it worked brilliantly. A well-made hand axe is a versatile, multi-purpose tool. It can butcher, scrape hides, dig in soil, chop wood, and even be thrown if needed. It is a knife, a scraper, a digger, all in one. But pure utility doesn't fully explain the obsessive symmetry, the refinement seen in the finest specimens. At sites like Boxgrove in England or Kalambo Falls in Zambia, some hand axes are works of meticulous craft, with perfect bilateral balance and smooth surfaces that seem to exceed mere functional need. This has led to other theories. Perhaps the hand axe was a teaching object, a way to demonstrate skill and knowledge. Perhaps the symmetry itself had a social or even aesthetic role, a way to signal intelligence, patience, and ability to potential mates or allies, like the intricate tail of a peacock. Or perhaps the symmetry was simply an unavoidable byproduct of mastering the flaking technique. The better you became, the more balanced and beautiful the tool became. We may never know for certain. What we do know is that the form mattered enough to be preserved and transmitted across countless generations. This transmission itself implies culture. Acheulean tool-making requires skill that isn't invented easily by each individual. It has to be learned through careful observation, imitation, and likely, direct teaching. This suggests a social world where knowledge transfer was becoming embedded. The scale of this cultural transmission is breathtaking. From Africa, the technology moved north into the Levant and Europe, and east into India. At sites in the Siwalik Hills, thousands of hand axes litter ancient landscapes. They were everywhere. And while regional variations existed, the core concept, a bifacial, pointed, handheld cutting tool, endured. Yet, for all this sophistication, there is a telling absence. We find no carvings, no beads, no decorations on these hand axes. Just function, refined to an almost artistic degree over eons. This creates a quiet tension in how we view early minds. We often equate intelligence with constant novelty, the relentless invention of new forms. But what if a deeper, more profound intelligence was expressed in conservation? In the careful, humble preservation of what works, in the recognition that not everything needs reinvention, that over 1 million years of stability is not a footnote in our history, it is the vast majority of it. For the overwhelming span of our time on Earth, we lived in small bands, used hand-shaped stone tools, and passed the techniques to do so through generations without writing, without formal schools, without monuments. The hand axe may not tell us what these hominins dreamed, but it tells us they could think in abstracts, that they remembered complex procedures, that they possessed immense patience. There is an elegance in the fact that this simple, teardropped form became humanity's first global design. Before the wheel, before the plow, before the temple or the city, there was the hand axe. Millions of them, scattered across deserts, riverbanks, and ancient grasslands, a silent, enduring language of stone that spoke across species and centuries. Eventually, of course, the Acheulean would fade, giving way to new technologies and new human forms. But for a span of time that dwarfs all of recorded history, that symmetrical point of stone was the signature of human presence. It's worth asking ourselves, how many of our own creations will last 1 million years? How many of our designs are worth preserving not for a season, but for an epoch? The haunting question is not whether the hand axe was the ultimate tool. It's whether it marked the first time a human looked at the world and decided, this shape has meaning. And then passed that idea on, again and again, until it became not just a habit, but a memory etched in stone itself. What happens when an animal decides to keep a piece of the sky? For almost the entire history of life, fire was a force of pure terror. It came from lightning strikes, volcanic fury, the dry crackle of a sun-scorched landscape, something to flee. But at some point, perhaps around 1 million years ago, a strange primate did something different. It stayed. It tended. That moment when fire ceased to be only a destroyer and became a tool, a source of warmth, a center for memory, may be one of the most quietly transformative in our story. This was not an invention, but an alliance. Not a weapon claimed, but a companion welcomed. Let's start with the fragile evidence. One of the oldest and most debated clues comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. In layers dating back close to 1 million years, researchers found burnt bone and plant remains deep inside the cave, a place where natural wildfires are unlikely to reach. This suggests someone carried fire into the darkness. But here's the catch: burn material only confirms use, not control. A branch could have been taken from a wildfire and sheltered. For decades, archaeologists have carefully distinguished between using fire and mastering it. The earliest clear hearths, structured, contained fire pits, don't become common until much later, around 400,000 years ago, at sites like Beech's Pit in England or Kizim Cave in Israel. These show layers of ash, concentrated burnt bone, and charcoal, evidence of fires built in the same spot repeatedly. These weren't accidents, they were part of the rhythm of life. Still, the origins run deeper. Even before reliable control, fire may have held profound social value. Some researchers suggest firekeeping, the skilled task of finding embers after a lightning strike and nurturing them for days or weeks, could have been one of our first specialized social roles. Keeping a flame alive without knowing how to start one might have been a sacred, communal responsibility. Because when you lose that flame on a cold night, you lose more than heat. You lose protection from predators, you lose light to extend the day, you lose the ability to cook, and perhaps you lose the very emotional heart of the group. And cooking, it turns out, changed our bodies. Raw meat and tough tubers demand long, energy-intensive digestion. Cooking acts like an external stomach, pre-processing food, making calories more accessible and reducing parasites. This externalization of digestion led to profound physiological shifts, shorter guts, smaller teeth, and it freed up metabolic energy that could be redirected, perhaps to fuel our expanding brains. But food was only part of the story. Fire kept predators at a distance. The flickering light and smell of smoke created a circle of safety in the dark. It extended the usable day, creating time after sunset for social bonding, tool-making, or simply resting in security. And in that extended, flickering light, something else may have been kindled: storytelling. Not in full language, perhaps, but in gesture, in rhythm, in the shared, mesmerized gaze into the flames. The fire circle may have been the first classroom, where the young watched skills demonstrated and the group's collective memory was forged in warmth and shadow. We still don't know exactly when our ancestors first made fire from scratch. Starting a flame without an existing ember is no trivial task. Friction methods like hand drilling require dry materials, precise technique, and immense patience. Percussion methods using flint and iron pyrite depend on having just the right minerals. We have no preserved fire-starting kits from this deep past, only indirect clues. The more centralized and recurrent fires become at archaeological sites, the more likely it is that the knowledge of ignition was possessed. Experimental archaeology shows that species like Homo heidelbergensis likely had the strength, dexterity, and cognitive ability to create fire with materials available to them. The act of striking a spark onto a prepared bundle of tinder isn't magic, but the conceptual leap it represents is monumental. Because once fire is yours to summon, time itself bends to your will. You can soften hides for clothing, warm infants, roast marrow, harden the tips of wooden spears, even boil water for medicinal plants. You can live in colder climates, sleep more securely, and gather not just for survival, but for ritual. By 400,000 years ago, this new pattern of living with fire becomes unmistakable. At Terra Amida in France, ancient hearths show organized activity. At Gesher Benat Yaakov in Israel, charred seeds and nuts hint at deliberate choices of fuel. At Schöningen in Germany, wooden spears are found near fire residues, suggesting technology enhanced by heat. These were not accidents, they were strategies. But fire, like so much in our deep past, was a slow revolution. There was no single moment of Promethean triumph. More likely, the relationship flickered for hundreds of thousands of years. Found, lost, rediscovered. Different groups may have mastered it independently. Others may have watched from the cold dark, guarding their precious, borrowed embers. Even today, in some cultures, fire is not just a thing you make. It's a thing you keep alive, a spark of knowledge passed down through teaching. And that is the haunting part. Fire didn't evolve. It didn't plan. But through persistence, through observation, through a kind of quiet genius, our ancestors entered into a partnership with it that reshaped our biology, our ecology, our social structures, and our nights. We now build cities of electric light to mimic the comfort of that primordial hearth. We chase energy in all its forms. No matter how advanced we become, a flame still draws us in, not merely for its utility, but because it feels alive. It dances, breathes, consumes. And in learning to tend it, perhaps we learned the first great lesson of all technology, that power must be cared for, not just possessed. So the question isn't merely when we first used fire. It's when we decided to keep it. Not as a lucky find, but as a way of life. That decision to preserve the spark may have been the first true act of choosing the future over the immediate present. A small, glowing act of hope. A silent promise. A memory that still flickers within the human mind. Perhaps the real secret isn't the fire itself, but the decision to sit beside it, to feed it, to build a life around its warmth. Because once you begin to live with flame, you start to think differently. You stay in one place a little longer. You return to the same shelter because the ash ring is still there. You anticipate the cold. Even if you don't yet know how to create the spark, you learn how to carry it. A smoldering log wrapped in damp moss, a coal nestled in clay. And over generations, the presence of fire becomes expected, the center around which life orbits. In its glow, for the first time, existence may have felt like more than survival. It may have felt like belonging, a pattern forming in the immense dark. From this point onward, our story would be different. The night would never be fully dark again. And every step we took, every tool we made, every memory we passed down, would carry within it the faint, enduring scent of wood smoke. For most of our deep history, humans were local whispers, shaped by the immediate press of wind and hunger. But around 700,000 years ago, a new kind of presence begins to appear across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. We call this group Homo heidelbergensis, though the name is more for our convenience than a perfect reflection of the variation we see. This was not a uniform population, but a wide-ranging, adaptable experiment in being human, one that may have already begun to see shapes in the mind before they existed in the hand. What makes this group so fascinating is also what makes them hard to define. From one fossil to the next, you glimpse flashes of something almost familiar. A thicker brow ridge here, a more modern jaw there, a robust body built for cold climates, or a slender frame still whispering of African origins. Their brain size nudged into the lower range of modern humans. But it wasn't just about volume, it was about application. These hominins didn't just endure, they engineered. At Schöningen in Germany, the damp earth preserved what stone cannot: wood. Here, archaeologists uncovered carefully crafted wooden spears, straight, balanced, and sharpened at both ends. Dated to over 400,000 years ago, they were likely throwing spears. These weren't simple pointed sticks. They were precision hunting weapons, requiring planning, skill, and likely teaching. With them came a new dimension of anticipation, thinking not just of the immediate moment, but of the future hunt. Across Africa and Europe, stone tools from this era start to show regional identities. Some groups perfected by facial hand axes, others began incorporating bone and antler into their toolkits. At Boxgrove in England, butchery sites reveal organized flaking debris and bones broken with systematic precision, hinting at communal effort. In northern Spain, sites like Atapuerca suggest deliberate deposition of bodies in deep caves, though whether this was ritual, sanitation, or something else, we may never know. In the Congo Basin, tools show adaptations to a rainforest world. Still sharp, still human, but fitted to a different kind of shadow. What unites these scattered populations is a growing complexity in behavior, not just technology. Repeated use of sites, possible simple shelters, and seasonal return patterns begin to whisper of memory. Perhaps not full language as we know it, but a rich communication capable of coordinating hunts, raising young, and maybe, in the silence, mourning the dead. The archaeological record doesn't give us their words, but it gives us spears shaped by hands that held stories. And then there is the question of destiny. Because this wide, variable lineage did not remain one. In different corners of the world, it began to fracture. Some branches gave rise to other now extinct humans. Others may have vanished into the quiet oblivion that claims most species. And in a few lines, without any awareness of what they were becoming, they laid the foundation for what would one day be called Homo sapiens. They were not us. but they were building the scaffold upon which we would eventually stand. So what prepares a species to branch, to turn one lineage into many? Is it the pressure of a changing climate, the isolation of vast distances, or simply the accumulated weight of small choices until they become irreversible? Perhaps Heidelbergensis didn't plan to split. Perhaps it just happened, as it always does in the flowing river of evolution. If you had met one of them on a foggy European plain, spear in hand, would you have seen an ancestor? Or just a skilled stranger who knew how to read the wind and aim true? It's tempting to draw a straight, clean line from them to us, as if Heidelbergensis was merely a waypoint on a predetermined road to modernity. But nature rarely drafts in straight lines. Evolution, human evolution especially, is not a ladder. It is a tangled bush, with many branches that lead nowhere. When we look closely at the fossil record from this time, we see not a single emerging hero, but a constellation of different hominins spread across continents, each facing unique winters, predators, and challenges. Each adapting in ways that made perfect sense for their world, but leave us guessing across the millennia. The African Heidelbergensis populations show traits leaning more toward what we'd call modern: lighter skulls, flatter faces. Their cousins in Europe often appear more robust, more cold-adapted, with prominent brow ridges and wide noses. Some may have already begun the long physiological adjustment to Ice Age winters, while others remained in the equatorial heat. And in Asia, the scant fossils we have suggest yet another variation, one we still struggle to understand. It's possible some eastern groups weren't Heidelbergensis at all, but descendants of even earlier migrations, evolving on their own terms. Their tools reflect this beautiful diversity. In some regions, hand axes remain the masterpiece, refined with almost obsessive care. In others, simple flake tools persisted alongside new, composite technologies, hafted points, shaped wooden implements, and perhaps the first adhesives made from plant resin or birch tar. These innovations didn't appear everywhere at once. They emerged, were lost, and re-emerged in a slow dance. The archaeological record isn't a neat timeline. It's a palimpsest, a manuscript written over, erased, and written over again. What does seem consistent is a growing capacity for foresight. At Gesher Benat Yaakov in Israel, we find evidence of repeated fire use and areas for processing food, including clusters of burnt nuts and seeds. At Terra Amida in France, what may be post holes suggest simple windbreaks or shelters. These are traces not of mere reaction, but of planning, temporary homes, managed spaces, social centers. And always, the implication of cooperation. Homo heidelbergensis was often large, with some individuals well over 6 feet tall, especially in colder regions. That size meant a high caloric demand, particularly in seasonal environments where food was not constant. Meeting that demand almost certainly required coordinated hunting, not just scavenging, but tracking, ambushing, and dividing labor. The kind of endeavor that rewards trust and punishes its absence. We cannot know the sound of their speech if it existed, but we can sense the presence of shared knowledge in the way their tools repeat and slowly evolve. A child learning to shape a core by watching a parent. A technique passing from one valley to the next, carried not in genes, but in memory and demonstration. Culture, in its earliest, slow-brewing form. And maybe this is why Heidelbergensis matters so deeply. Not because they were the first to think, or speak, or bury their dead, but because they stood at a precipice of possibility. In them, we see the moment when the human story became plural. Not one species, but many. Not a single future, but several possible ones, radiating outward like sparks from a fire that they themselves were only learning to fully control. They were a threshold species, and they never knew it. Which makes you wonder, what thresholds are we standing upon today, completely unaware of the future branches we are creating? What happens when humans become prisoners of geography? Not stranded for a season, but isolated for millennia, not by accident, but by rising seas. It turns out the rules of biology are indifferent to who you are. When a species is confined to an island, it begins to change. This is not myth or speculation. It is mathematical inevitability. Large animals tend to shrink. Small animals tend to grow. Resources are limited, predators are few, and over generations, a strange alchemy occurs. Your body forgets the mainland. Evolution trims and tailors. Limbs shorten, brains reshape. The island rewrites your blueprint. And in a few thousand years, you are something new, not lesser, but different, singular, and exquisitely adapted to your own small world. Sometime between 1 million and 50,000 years ago, this happened to us. Or at least, to some of us. The discovery came from a cave on the Indonesian island of Flores, buried beneath layers of silt and time. In 2003, researchers uncovered a nearly complete skeleton of a tiny hominin. She stood just over a meter tall. Her skull was unlike anything in the textbooks. Yet, she was undoubtedly a kind of human, a different kind. She became known as LB1, or more famously, the Hobbit. This was not merely a short Homo erectus. This was a separate evolutionary experiment, hidden from the rest of the world. The remains were found in Liang Bua Cave, a cool, sheltered chamber in the volcanic highlands. Inside were stone tools, animal bones, and signs of long-term habitation. Some of the tools were surprisingly sophisticated, small, sharp flakes for cutting and shaping. But the shock wasn't just the tools. It was who had made them. Homo floresiensis had a brain size of around 400 cubic centimeters, smaller than a chimpanzee's. And yet, they crafted tools, butchered animals like the island's pygmy stegodon, a dwarf elephant, and may have even used fire. We cannot be certain of all their capabilities, but whatever they were doing, they did it for a remarkably long time. Fossils suggest they may have lived on Flores for hundreds of thousands of years, possibly even overlapping briefly with our own species before vanishing into the quiet of extinction. To the north, another island held another secret. In the Philippines, deep within Calao Cave on the island of Luzon, a few small teeth and bone fragments surfaced in 2007. At first, they seemed too scant to tell a story. But as more material was found, a pattern emerged. These remains, dating to at least 67,000 years ago, belonged to yet another species, Homo luzonensis. Like the Flores hominins, they were small and uniquely built. Their molars were strangely simple, their finger and toe bones curved like those of tree dwellers, blending primitive and advanced traits in a puzzling mosaic. They may have descended from early Homo erectus migrants who became isolated, or they may represent an even more ancient lineage entirely. Either way, they are another forgotten experiment. A human form sculpted in complete ecological isolation. This is where the island rule transcends biology and becomes philosophy. These were humans who evolved differently not because of some superior spark, but simply because of where the tides and tectonics left them. Their story was driven not by conquest or innovation, but by the indifferent forces of sea level and geology. They were not reaching for the stars, they were surviving within a boundary they could not cross. What is perhaps most humbling is how little absolute brain size seems to have dictated capability. For centuries, we assumed cognition scaled directly with cranial volume, that a small brain meant a simple mind. But the tools of Flores and the dexterity implied by the Luzon fossils suggest otherwise. These humans, if we still use that word, were doing things we once thought required a certain neurological threshold. But maybe it was never about sheer size. Maybe it was about time, about accumulated culture, about the slow, patient feedback loop of learning, copying, and adapting that does not demand genius, only persistence. And if that's true, what else have we missed? How many other human stories slipped through the cracks of our assumptions, their bones dissolved in acidic soil or still hidden beneath jungle canopies? We name species from fragments of teeth and bone, but entire ways of being human may have flickered and vanished without leaving a single artifact within reach of our trowels. Today, both Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis are extinct. We don't know precisely when or why they disappeared. Rising seas, volcanic eruptions, disease, or perhaps contact with a new, invasive cousin, Homo sapiens, may have been the cause. The truth is lost to us. And in that absence of knowledge, we are reminded that this grand story is still being written, with many pages missing. If humans could evolve into such distinct forms on Flores and Luzon, and perhaps on other islands we have yet to explore deeply, we must ask, how many versions of us were there? How many parallel experiments did evolution run before history was written by the survivors? In the silence of those empty caves, among the layers of ash and the bones of dwarfed creatures, a question lingers. If they were human enough to make tools, to hunt, to gather, were they also human enough to wonder? Did they ever gaze at the endless ocean and dream of where they had come from? We will almost certainly never know. But maybe that is precisely the point, that not all stories leave an echo. Some humans were simply brief, beautiful, and lost to the deep currents of time. Did Neanderthals possess an inner world? It sounds like a poetic, almost unanswerable question. But beneath the sentiment lies a serious scientific inquiry. If by an inner world, we mean the capacity to symbolize, to grieve, to imagine realities beyond the immediate physical one, then the search becomes archaeological. It becomes about pigments, patterns, and deliberate arrangements in the dark. And between 400,000 and 40,000 years ago, there was a species in Europe, the Near East, and parts of Asia that seems to have been doing exactly that. Their bones were thick, their brows were heavy, their tools expertly flaked. And somewhere along their long journey, something beyond mere survival began to appear in the record. Not just utility, but symbol. For much of the 20th century, Neanderthals were caricatured as brutish, a sideline in the human story, strong but dim, lacking the spark of modern cognition. But evidence, patiently unearthed, did not care for these biases. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, a Neanderthal body was found carefully placed in a shallow pit, its limbs flexed, absent of predator marks, with stone tools beside it. This suggested intentional burial, not just disposal, but an act of care. Later, at Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan, the famous flower burial of Shanidar IV, with clusters of flower pollen in the soil, hinted at possible mortuary ritual, though the interpretation remains debated. The consistent theme, however, is deliberate attention to the dead. Burials were only the beginning. Across Europe, researchers began to find traces of pigment, especially red ochre. It wasn't smeared randomly, it was collected, stored, and sometimes applied. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, perforated and pigment-stained seashells were found, showing where patterns that suggest they were strung as beads or pendants. These were not tools, not food. They were decoration, personal adornment. Even bones became a canvas. At the Grotte du Renne in France, associated with Neanderthal layers, researchers found personal ornaments like pierced animal teeth and ivory rings alongside their distinctive stone tools. While some debate the exact context, the possibility remains that Neanderthals were engaging in behaviors once considered exclusive to our species. And then it gets stranger. Deep within Bruniquel Cave in southern France, nearly 400 meters from the entrance, broken stalagmites were arranged into large, deliberate circular structures. They were blackened by fire. Uranium series dating places them at over 175,000 years old, firmly in the time of Neanderthals. There are no signs of habitation here, no bones, no tools. Just these mysterious rings of stone, built in profound darkness and illuminated by torchlight. If this was not symbolic behavior, it was dancing on its very edge, a structure with no apparent physical purpose, built in a place of palpable potency. Something was happening in those minds, and that something points toward a consciousness we are still learning to comprehend. Neanderthals were anatomically distinct from us, broader, stronger, with adaptations for cold climates. But their brains were large, in some cases larger than the average modern humans. The shape was different, perhaps with more emphasis on visual spatial processing, but not lacking in complexity. Their stone tool technology, the Mousterian, included refined levallois techniques for producing predictable flakes and evidence of hafting stone points to wooden spears. They planned, they curated their resources, they returned to quarries across seasons. But again, this speaks to practical intelligence. The deeper question is whether they had an internal culture, shared mental models, traditions passed down and refined. And here, we can only infer. Bone does not preserve a campfire song. Stone does not fossilize a lament. But every ochre-stained shell, every carefully placed body, every hidden structure in the deep dark hints at something more than instinct. It hints at a slow, intentional, perhaps even sacred dimension to life. The evidence, however, is not one-sided. At El Sidrón Cave in Spain, the bones of 12 Neanderthals, men, women, and children from the same family group, bore cut marks and were fractured from marrow, likely during a period of severe starvation. This act of survival cannibalism is not symbolic. It is brutal necessity. But even in this stark reality, something profoundly human pulses, for culture encompasses not only our beauty but also our desperation, our capacity to make horrific choices when the world turns cold. Then there is Cueva de Ardales, also in Spain. Deep within, a stalagmite formation was deliberately marked with red ochre. The paint was applied more than 65,000 years ago, long before any evidence of Homo sapiens in the region. The artist, if we may use that word, was Neanderthal. Intriguingly, the pigment wasn't applied just once, it was reapplied over thousands of years. A tradition, a memory revisited. We don't know what it meant, but the choice to return and remark the same space suggests it held significance. This is what unsettles the old, simplistic narratives. It's not one site, it's a gathering pattern. Careful burial, pigment use, ornamentation, enigmatic structures. None alone proves a symbolic mind, but together they form a shape, a blurry, shifting silhouette of a creature who did not merely survive, but thought, remembered, perhaps mourned, and possibly sought meaning beyond the tangible. Of course, we must be cautious. The line between function and symbol is whisper-thin. Red ochre can be used to treat hides. Shells can be collected for practical use. But there is a world of difference between collecting and curating, between using pigment and applying it to the body of the dead. That difference is where the inner world, the soul, if you will, might reside. Today, our mental image of Neanderthals is slowly being corrected. The heavy brow remains, but behind it, we now envision a mind full of nuance and depth. A species not identical to us, but not entirely alien. They lived in small, tight-knit bands. They endured glacial winters. They crafted complex tools. They buried their loved ones. And in the flickering light of their hearts, they may have told stories whose contours we can never recover. So, did they possess an inner life? We cannot definitively answer. But they used symbols. They returned to meaningful places. They left behind traces of care. And perhaps, for now, that is enough. Perhaps their story is not one of primitive survival, but of parallel depth. A separate lineage of thought, emotion, and expression that walked a different path. And that makes their disappearance all the more poignant. Not just that they are gone, but that we never heard their version of the world. That somewhere, in a collapsed cave or a flooded chamber, the final artifact, the last carved bone, the final ochre spiral, might still wait to remind us that humanity was never just one shape. It was always a chorus of many voices. Some of those voices are still silent, buried in the dark. What does the true dawn of our own kind look like? Not the dawn of cities and stories, but the biological dawn. The slow shift of bone and brain into a form we would recognize in a mirror. If you stood in Africa around 300,000 years ago, you might have seen nothing remarkable. No new monuments, no sudden revolution in tools. Just scattered groups of hominins walking familiar plains, using familiar flakes. But in their skeletons, something different was quietly taking root. A change not in how they lived, but in who they were becoming. For much of the last century, paleoanthropology favored a neat story. Homo sapiens emerged in a single, swift event in East Africa around 200,000 years ago. But fossils, as they often do, resisted the tidy script. In the Moroccan desert near Jebel Irhoud, archaeologists uncovered remains that didn't fit. A partial skull, jaw fragments, and tools. Initial dating suggested they were modern, but perhaps only 40,000 years old. Then, new thermoluminescence dating of the flint tools pushed the age back dramatically to around 315,000 years. And the bones? They looked familiar, yet not entirely modern. The brow ridge was pronounced, the brain case elongated, but the face was tucked under the skull in a more modern way. The features fell within a plausible early range for Homo sapiens. This meant our story needed to start earlier, and in a different place, Northwest Africa, far from the traditional East African cradle. A similar challenge came from Omo Kaibish in Ethiopia. A skull known as Omo I was found in layers of volcanic ash. For years, its age was placed around 195,000 years. But a recent reassessment of the volcanic ash linked it to a known eruption, pushing the minimum date back to at least 233,000 years. And Omo I, with its rounded skull and clear chin, looked unmistakably like us. The change, however, was not a sudden explosion. Homo sapiens did not spring forth fully formed from one location. The evidence now points to a Pan-African origin. The features we consider modern emerged gradually, like a mosaic coming together, across widely scattered populations from South Africa to the Sahel to the Mediterranean coast. Groups with shared ancestry exchanged genes, tools, and adaptations over hundreds of millennia. Slowly, the anatomical puzzle settled into the familiar picture. One of the key transitions was in brain shape, not just size. Our ancestors already had brains as large as ours, but the structure shifted. In earlier hominins like Homo heidelbergensis or Neanderthals, the brain case was long and low. Over time, in our lineage, it became more globular, rounded, with a reorganization of internal areas that may have influenced social behavior, memory, and cognitive flexibility. The cause is still debated, linked perhaps to changes in development or facial structure, but this globularization marks a quiet turning point, a head now sculpted to hold a different kind of mind. The skeletal changes were subtle but profound. A flatter face, smaller teeth, a more delicate jaw, a shifted pelvis, different limb proportions. These weren't cosmetic tweaks, they were signs of a lineage honing in on a specific biological platform. A platform for what would one day enable the cultural explosion we call behavioral modernity. But that explosion had not yet happened. Between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, these early Homo sapiens still lived in small, mobile bands. They hunted and gathered. Their stone tools, to an untrained eye, looked much like those of their predecessors. They left footprints, hearths, and refuse piles. What they did not leave, yet, were clear, unambiguous signs of art, personal adornment, or symbolic ritual. This is a crucial reminder. Anatomy and behavior do not evolve in lockstep. A modern skeleton does not guarantee a modern mind as we define it. Nor does a large brain automatically mean language, art, or complex narrative. The earliest members of our species may have looked like us, but they likely did not think like us, or at least, not in the ways we now take for granted. Their world was still anchored in immediate survival, seasonal movement, and reproduction. Whatever rich internal lives they had, they were not yet being externalized in pigment or curated object. And yet, they endured. Through shifting climates, arid phases, and ecological booms and busts, they persisted. Fossils from places like Herto in Ethiopia, dated to about 160,000 years ago, show individuals with strong modern features alongside evidence of butchery and tool use. Skulls from Florisbad in South Africa and Border Cave add to the picture of a morphologically diverse, widely spread lineage. The puzzle is beautifully messy because that is the nature of real science, of real becoming. This makes the haunting question even sharper. What would it have felt like to be them? To inhabit a body so close to our own? In a world without symbolic artifacts, without stored stories? Was the sense of self already there, waiting for a means of expression? Did they name the constellations, or simply navigate by them? We cannot know. But their bones whisper that something significant was beginning. Not a revolution, but a long, slow ignition. A species becoming itself, one quiet birth, one patient generation at a time. Why did our ancestors begin to paint with earth? Before maps, before alphabets, before leaving their home continent, they were already coloring cave walls with red ochre, engraving crosshatches into bone, and stringing shells into necklaces they never ate. Sometime between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to do something strange and beautifully unnecessary. We began to symbolize. And we did it long before there was any audience but ourselves. Follow the southern coastline of Africa, near the modern Cape, and you'll find a sandstone cliff sheltering a cave called Blombos. At first glance, it's a shallow opening facing the wind and sea. But beneath layers of sand, archaeologists uncovered a whisper of something profound. Blocks of ochre, rubbed smooth from use, some deliberately engraved with geometric patterns. Cross-hatched lines etched into the soft, iron-rich stone. Dated to around 75,000 years ago, perhaps older. This is not the first use of ochre, but Blombos offers something clearer, not just pigment, but pattern. Not just color, but clear context. Because buried nearby were perforated seashells, tiny nacreous beads, worn smooth, likely strung on a cord. There's no sign they were eaten. They were ornaments. Adornment. Some shells were sourced from dozens of kilometers away, telling us the action was purposeful. The intention was not utility. It was meaning. In another part of the cave, a small slab of stone was found, engraved with a deliberate geometric design, a grid of carefully incised lines. Again, no functional explanation as a cutting board or tool. It was simply marked, possibly with memory, possibly with identity, but undeniably marked by a mind that could think beyond the immediate moment. Perhaps the most stunning find was not the pigment or the beads, but a toolkit. In a layer dated to about 100,000 years ago, lay an abalone shell used as a container for mixing ochre. Next to it, a bone spatula for stirring, traces of charcoal, a hammerstone, a paint-making kit. Here, the cognitive leap is inescapable. Our ancestors weren't just collecting ochre, they were processing it. Grinding, mixing, storing. Not randomly, but systematically with a recipe over time. This is harder to grasp than a spontaneous painting. The kit implies repetition, a tradition, a teacher, a student. It implies culture being passed down. Across southern Africa, similar signs emerge. At Pinnacle Point, red ochre appears in layers over 160,000 years old. At Sibudu Cave, evidence of compound adhesives, ochre mixed with plant resin to haft stone points to wooden shafts, shows a technical, cognitive symbolism. The ability to bind unlike materials into a new, unified tool with a purpose beyond the sum of its parts. But the symbolism wasn't only technical. At Border Cave, we find decorated ostrich eggshell beads, ochre-stained tools, and even bedding layered with aromatic plants, perhaps for comfort or to repel insects, always arranged, chosen, curated. And through it all runs the red thread of ochre. For ochre is more than a color. It is a signal, a substance that binds across cultures and millennia. Rich in iron, common in soil, unnecessary for survival, but chosen by human groups across continents and epochs. From the earliest sapiens in Africa to Aboriginal body paint to Ice Age European burials, ochre is the one thing we keep returning to long before we had words for blood or rust. What does that say about us? That the impulse to mark, to decorate, to leave a sign, is not the endpoint of civilization, but its very beginning. That we crossed into the realm of symbolism not with temples, but with scratches on stone and streaks of red clay on skin. What drove it? Memory? Status? Ritual? Religion? The truth is, we don't know. The patterns are consistent, the pigments are real, but the meanings are lost to time. There are no cave manuals, just layers of ash, ochre, and shell whispering a story we're still learning to translate. Perhaps it wasn't a single meaning. Perhaps it was simply practice, the slow accumulation of behaviors that, together, hinted at something more, a growing capacity for abstraction, a sense that the world contained patterns, echoes, and identities that could be shaped and shared. This was before our great global dispersal, before the ice retreated and oceans rose. But already, in the southern tip of Africa, the seeds of the symbolic mind had taken root. Not in a single act of genius, but in the quiet, persistent repetition of small, unnecessary acts. A line engraved on ochre, a shell worn around the neck, a pigment prepared for a tomorrow its maker might not see. And so we return to the haunting question, why did they do it? Why did early humans, long before maps or myths, feel the need to mark their world in red? Was it for beauty? For belief? Or was it something simpler, older? The first quiet murmur of a species beginning to see its own reflection in the world? Whatever the answer, it left a trace. And that trace runs through us still. From the walls of Blombos to the fingertips of every child who draws without reason, the red thread continues. What did the earth feel like when we first stepped into its emptiness? Not an emptiness of life, but an emptiness of us. No prior footprints in the sand, no smoke on a distant horizon, no other sapiens. Just open sky, unfamiliar stars, and a horizon that promised nothing but the unknown. Sometime between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, already anatomically modern, already carrying ochre and beads and hafted tools, took their first tentative steps beyond the African continent that had cradled their entire species. The world beyond had no idea what was coming. The first clues are subtle. A tooth in a cave. A stone flake in ancient sediment. These are not armies or caravans. They are scouts, small family groups, moving along river corridors, tracing coastlines, following game, escaping drought, or perhaps simply drawn by the curvature of the earth. For decades, the story of human migration was simple. A single exodus from East Africa around 60,000 years ago, a clean sweep into the Levant, replacing all in their path. But evidence resists simplicity. Fossils from Mislia Cave in Israel, part of an upper jaw, suggest sapiens may have been in the Levant as early as 170,000 years ago. Other fragments from Greece hint at even earlier, failed expansions. These were not mass migrations, but pulses, explorations that perhaps ended without descendants. What they show is that the pattern had begun. The urge to explore, to test the boundaries of the known world. By around 70,000 years ago, the most successful and lasting migration began. Genetic evidence points to a subset of Homo sapiens in East Africa that expanded and gave rise to all non-African peoples alive today. This expansion was not a tidal wave. It was a trickle. Small bands, perhaps only dozens of individuals at a time, moving along the southern coast of Arabia, clinging to shorelines rich in shellfish, mangroves, and estuaries. This was not an inland conquest, it was coastal wandering. The southern dispersal route is supported by archaeology and ancient geography. Sea levels were lower, exposing land bridges and shortening ocean crossings. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait might have been a manageable swim or raft journey. Once into Arabia, the path eastward was dotted with oases and freshwater sources. The oldest unambiguous signs of sapiens outside Africa and the Levant appear in Southeast Asia and Australia. Sites like Lake Mungo and Majbib in Australia suggest human presence at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This means that by the time Homo sapiens first entered Europe, they had already reached the opposite end of the Earth. Getting to Australia was no small feat. It required crossing Wallacea, a zone of deep ocean trenches and islands never connected to the mainland, even at the lowest sea levels. This means early humans had to build some form of watercraft, rafts, dugouts, capable of open sea travel. They had to carry children, supplies, and hope across treacherous waters with no guarantee of landfall. And yet, they did it. Not once, but likely many times over generations. Australia was not settled in a single leap, but through a series of island-hopping voyages across what is now Indonesia and Timor. Along the way, Homo sapiens encountered a world unlike any they had known. Giant monitor lizards, towering flightless birds, massive marsupials, a bestiary that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. For the first time, humans entered ecosystems where the large animals had no evolved fear of them. Their arrival would have consequences, though we leave the complex question of extinction for another time. It is enough to note that a species with fire, tools, social coordination, and endurance was meeting a naive world. But before consequences, there must have been awe. Imagine that moment, stepping onto a new continent, hearing animal calls with no names, seeing tracks in the mud with no stories to explain them, walking into a landscape your ancestors had never imagined, and realizing you were truly alone. No rival smoke, no drums in the distance. Just land, waiting. In the archaeological record, we find scattered clues, charred shells, stone flakes, ochre stains. It's not grand, but it's persistent. It tells us that humans not only reached these places, but stayed, adapted, and flourished across coasts, jungles, and deserts. Homo sapiens was no longer just a species, it was becoming a global pattern, a force. This period, from 100,000 to 60,000 years ago, is sometimes overshadowed by the art and complexity that came later. But this was the quiet, fundamental revolution, the expansion that made all else possible. And it did not happen with conquest. It happened with footsteps, with patience, with a deep-seated curiosity. So the question lingers, what did it feel like to leave behind the only lands your kind had ever known? To cross a river with no name? To bring your beads and ochre to a place where the red dirt was different and the animals were strangers? We cannot know. But the silence they stepped into was not a void. It was a canvas. And they carried with them, in their minds and in their hands, the first colors. And they were not done walking. What kind of creature teaches itself to sew and to dream in pictures? Somewhere between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, a new kind of memory began to appear on the walls of deep caves. Not written history, but something closer to felt experience. A charging bison, a field of red dots, a handprint stenciled in pigment by someone with a crooked finger. These were not accidents. They were deliberate, precise, and placed far from any weathering wind or rain. They weren't mere decoration. They were decisions made in the dark, and they changed what a human mind could hold and project. This wasn't the absolute birth of art. That spark had flickered earlier in Africa with engravings and beads. But this was something else. The world transformed into symbol on a monumental scale. It started quietly, in the deep silence. In the Ardèche region of what is now France, a rockfall sealed the entrance to a limestone cave. Behind it, preserved for tens of thousands of years, was a gallery of vibrant life. Lions with taut shoulders, horses seeming to gallop in herds, some drawn with multiple heads to imply motion. Owls, mammoths, woolly rhinos, species no longer found together anywhere on Earth. In the flicker of torchlight, these animals still seemed to breathe. The walls of Chauvet Cave had become a theater of memory. Radiocarbon dates place many images around 35,000 years ago, some possibly older. The people who made them weren't recording a single event. They were expressing a way of seeing, a way of marking time without numbers. And they weren't alone. On the other side of the world, in a limestone cave called Ling Tidong on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, a pig was painted in deep red pigment. It stands alert, its body robust, tusks curving, one foot lifted as if in mid-step. Hand stencils frame it, a human presence felt though not seen. Dated to at least 45,000 years ago, it is among the oldest known figurative paintings. And it is not isolated. Across Indonesia, across Europe, into the heart of continents, we see the same impulse. Human beings crawling into darkness to leave behind a mark. Not for gods they could name, not for strangers, but perhaps for memory itself. Simultaneously, another quiet technology was emerging, equally transformative and easy to overlook. The needle. Not a sharp thorn, but a true bone needle, often with a polished eye for threading sinew or plant fiber. These tools appear around 35,000 years ago. They allowed for something revolutionary, tailored clothing. In Ice Age Europe, this was a matter of survival. Loose wraps could keep you warm, but stitched garments trapped heat, repelled moisture, and freed hands for work. The needle was a survival tool, but it was also an act of care. one that required planning, skill, and an intimate understanding of the human form as something worthy of protection. These two innovations, the cave image and the sewn garment, might seem unrelated. One is expressive, the other practical. One exists in ritual darkness, the other moves through the biting cold above ground. But both reflect the same blossoming capacity, abstraction. The ability to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be. A lion on a wall, a thread through a needle's eye, both are visions made real through patience and skill. And both imply something that doesn't fossilize, shared teaching. Someone had to show the young how to see the animal in the rock's contour, how to draw it. Someone had to demonstrate how to tension a stitch, how to make a sleeve that fit. These were not instincts. They were traditions, and they required time to transmit. Across Eurasia, this explosion of creativity left an archaeological record that feels dense with possibility. In the Czech Republic, ivory, Venus, figurines with exaggerated forms suggest symbolic representation of fertility or social status. In Germany, flutes carved from bird bone and mammoth ivory hold the potential for melody, instruments of emotional expression. In Siberia, beads, carvings, and pierced animal teeth were threaded onto garments or bodies, worn, and buried with the dead. None of this was strictly necessary for survival in a bare sense. But all of it was about surviving as something more than a biological organism. It was about being a person in a web of meaning. This is where the modern human begins to feel hauntingly familiar. Not in the skull's shape, but in the patterns we leave behind. The desire to represent, to adorn, to carry meaning, to wear memory against the skin, to leave behind a whisper that says, "I was here. I saw this." It's easy to overinterpret, to imagine organized religion or complex myth where there may have been simple craft or personal expression. But it's also hard to ignore the density of the pattern. When the same types of pigments and ornaments appear in distant groups with no possible contact, we glimpse something beyond local ingenuity, cultural transmission, ideas that spread, techniques that endured, minds that remembered. Yet, with all this evidence, so much remains unknowable. Who shaped the first figurine? What did a red ochre spiral mean? Was it a child's practice or a shaman's symbol? Were these images part of storytelling, or solitary reflection, or even a form of grief? We cannot say, but we can look at them and feel a connection across the abyss of years. Because the story of the Stone Age is not just a story of tools. It is a story of symbols. And symbols are strange, powerful things. They ask us to see connections between unrelated concepts, to believe that a handprint in a cave can outlive the hand that made it. That may be the fundamental difference, the need to turn experience into something that endures. A mark, a thread, a melody played on a bone flute long after the breath that created it is gone. When we look at those caves, those needles, those beads and flutes, we are not just seeing the origin of art or fashion. We are witnessing the birth of a new relationship with time itself. A time where the past could be carried forward. A time where the invisible could be made tangible, and therefore, remembered. So what kind of animal teaches itself to sow and to dream? The kind that will, eventually, need to remember. How many kinds of human have walked this earth? 20? The honest answer is, we don't know. And that's not an evasion, it's the current state of science. We have found just enough bones to prove most of the story is missing. Enough ancient DNA to know we are not alone in our own blood. And enough genetic ghosts in our cells to whisper that long after the last skeleton crumbled to dust, their legacy persists. Quiet, invisible, but undeniable. By 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was not the only human on the planet. Far from it. Across the mountains of Central Asia, in the caves of Siberia, and in the deep history of island Southeast Asia, there were others. Some we know from fossils. Some we know only as phantoms in our genome. Start with the Denisovans. We have never found a complete Denisovan skeleton. Not one. No skull for reconstruction. Instead, we found a single finger bone fragment from a young girl in Denisova Cave, Siberia, dated to over 40,000 years ago. It seemed insignificant until genetic sequencing revealed an entirely new kind of human. Not Neanderthal, not sapiens, but a distinct branch. Then came the molars, huge, robust teeth from the same cave, matching the girl's DNA. This population had their own long history, their own adaptations. And they were not confined to Siberia. Their genetic signature shows up in modern populations in Papua New Guinea, Tibet, Melanesia, the Philippines, and Australia. Some people today carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. And that DNA isn't junk. It includes genetic variants like ES1, which helps regulate oxygen use at high altitude, a trait inherited by modern Tibetans. It gets stranger. The Denisovan DNA in modern Melanesians is different from that in Tibetans. Different enough to suggest there may not have been one Denisovan population, but several, separated for hundreds of thousands of years. This is where the concept of ghost populations takes hold. A ghost population is a group of humans who must have existed because we carry their genes, but whose fossils we have never found. Their only evidence is in the seams of our DNA, like fingerprints in ash. You know a hand was there, but the hand itself is gone. We now believe in at least two major Denisovan lineages, possibly more. One interbred with sapiens somewhere in Southeast Asia. This makes sense alongside fossil mysteries from the islands. The strange small hominins from Flores and Luzon. Perhaps some were Denisovans. Perhaps they were something else entirely. Perhaps they are the ghosts themselves. But Denisovans aren't the only whispers. In West Africa, genetic studies point to a mysterious archaic lineage that contributed up to 19% of the DNA in some modern populations. Yet we have no fossil, no site, no name. Just a genetic signal. A ghost. This hidden diversity reshapes our view of the Stone Age. We once imagined a simple story. Modern humans swept out of Africa and replaced everyone else. But the more ancient DNA we recover, the messier and more beautiful the truth becomes. We didn't just replace. We met. We absorbed. We had children with other kinds of humans. The Denisovan girl from Siberia wasn't even fully Denisovan. Genetic analysis shows her father had Neanderthal ancestry as well. She was a hybrid of hybrids, a genetic testament to a planet that wasn't empty, but full of different human experiments. We used to think of a straight line from the past to us. Now we know it was a braid. And some strands of that braid are missing, lost to time. But their legacy remains in our immune systems, in our metabolism, in the very way our bodies handle altitude or process nutrients. For every ghost population we've detected, there are likely others we haven't. The limits of ancient DNA mean we can only find what preservation allows. The Stone Age was vast, and most of it is still unseen. Somewhere, under forest or sea or ice, lie the bones of humans who never made it into our stories, who spoke languages we will never hear, who looked at the same stars and wondered things we will never translate. But they were real. They were here. And a part of them, quite literally, still is. So maybe the question isn't how many kinds of humans there were. Maybe the question is, how many are left quietly within us? The cold did not arrive in a single season. It was a slow tightening, a planetary breath held for millennia. By 30,000 years ago, much of the Earth's northern hemisphere had become a locked chamber of wind and ice. Massive glaciers smothered what are now cities, forests, and farms under kilometers of crushing white. But not everything was frozen. In the shadows of these ice sheets, in the margins of mountain ranges, refugia persisted, places where life and humans could find a precarious foothold. These ice-free corridors were never warm, but they were just survivable enough. And that was all it took. The humans who endured here were not adapted like woolly mammoths or cave bears. They didn't grow thick fur or hibernate. Instead, they remembered. And that memory, passed down as fire-making, clothing, cooperation, and perfected survival strategy, was enough to keep their lineage alive through the coldest dreams our planet has ever had. This chapter is not about transformation, but about sheer, stubborn persistence. Between 30,000 and 15,000 years ago, The planet entered the last glacial maximum, LGM, the final deep freeze of the Pleistocene. Ice reached its greatest extent. Northern Europe became a white desert. The interior of North America vanished beneath an unbroken ice sheet. Sea levels plunged as water was locked away, revealing land bridges. Entire coastlines we know today were simply dry, cold plains. The Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia to Alaska. Australia and New Guinea merged into a single continent called Sahul. Britain was an extension of mainland Europe. Continents reconfigured in silence, and humans, small, warm-blooded, and tenacious, followed the gaps and shadows. On the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, cold, dry grassland stretching from Western Europe through Siberia and into Alaska, Homo sapiens found a strange, stark abundance. The cold was brutal, but the ecology was not barren. This frozen savanna supported a spectacular array of megafauna: woolly mammoths and rhinos, giant deer, cave lions, musk oxen. The hunter-gatherers of the steppe adapted to this large game bounty. It was a feast on ice. Archaeological sites tell of their quiet ingenuity. At Kostenki in Russia, layered hearths, carved ivory, and dwellings built from mammoth bones speak of long-term knowledge and adaptation. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, impressions in clay reveal the earliest known woven textiles. At Sungir, north of Moscow, a burial of two adolescents adorned with thousands of meticulously crafted mammoth ivory beads testifies to social bonds that transcended life itself. The cold did not erase culture. If anything, it demanded and deepened it. Further east, along the fringes of Mongolia and the Amur River basin, similar adaptations took shape. Here, too, humans hunted mammoth and horse, stitched tailored clothing, and created portable toolkits for life on the move across snowy plains. Further south, in the ice-free refugia of China, Southeast Asia, and India, humans continued in warmer pockets. But even there, the global chill reshaped migration patterns and resource use. Caves became storage vaults and shelters. Rivers, slowed by the cold, remained vital lifelines. Forests shrank, replaced in places by open grassland. In Japan, people clung to coasts, hunting sea mammals and fishing. In Sahul, they adapted to arid deserts and mountain forests. The oldest known highland site in Australia at Lake Mungo continued to be used even through the colder phases. These scattered but resilient pockets of human persistence reveal a species capable of flexing across nearly every biome Earth could muster. Not through superior strength, but through memory, fire, and the mastery of layered technology. What did they wear? Bone-sewing needles are found at Upper Paleolithic sites across Eurasia. The existence of tailored, multi-layered clothing is inferred from the simple fact of survival. Without it, life in such latitudes would have been impossible. We find hide scrapers and bone awls in abundance. Clothing, like fire, became an extension of the body's own systems. The skin no longer ended at the epidermis. It was now sheathed in leather, fur, and woven fiber. Every stitch was a line of evolutionary poetry, a technology written in sinew and bone, spoken in the silence of a snowbound night. And then there were the shelters. While many remained nomadic, some groups in the coldest regions built semi-permanent dwellings. At Meshurik in Ukraine, archaeologists found circular huts constructed from mammoth skulls, tusks, and hides, their interiors blackened from long-term hearth use. These were not temporary camps. They were homes. And within their soot-stained, bone-walled confines, something else flickered: memory, kinship, the passing of knowledge from one brittle winter to the next. Migration during this peak cold slowed but did not stop. As the ice reached its maximum, the great corridors, river valleys, coastlines, became narrower, more challenging. Still, humans found paths forward. They moved into the Americas, crossing the Bering Land Bridge perhaps before 20,000 years ago, though the evidence remains debated. They reached the tip of South America not long after in geological terms. They moved around the Indian coastline and pushed into the heart of Central Asia. With each new site, they left traces: a hearth, a discarded flake, the bones of a meal. Most of these traces were never meant to last. But enough survived to tell us this. Even at the very edge of planetary habitability, humans kept going. But not because they had to, but because they could. The last great freeze of the Pleistocene wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a final rehearsal for everything that would come next. When the ice finally began to melt, slowly, unevenly, chaotically, it revealed more than just new land. It revealed that the species who had survived the deep cold was no longer merely surviving. It had become something restless, resilient, and dangerously adept at remembering. And so the cold retreated, but the memory of it lingered. It lingered in bones hardened by scarcity, in mythologies of a great winter, in stories whispered by firelight about animals that no longer walked the earth. It lingered in the hidden genetics of cold-adapted metabolisms and in compact body proportions. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, you carry some of that cold within you. The shape of your nose, the way your skin responds to wind, your body's instinct to store fat, a craving for warmth and rich food when tired, these are not modern quirks. They are echoes. They are fossils of survival written not in stone, but in you. No single moment defines this long winter. There was no invention that changed everything overnight. No revolution, just the persistent, patient application of fire, bead, flint, bone, shelter, and memory stretched across generations like a lifeline through the dark. Which leaves us, as always, with a question. If we had not endured that cold, if one especially long winter had broken the chain, if a crucial migration had failed, would there be anyone left to remember it at all? 15,000 years ago, the world began to thaw. What had been locked in frozen silence started to shift, drip, and surge into something new. The glaciers defining the Pleistocene were in retreat. And with their withdrawal came something almost stranger than the ice itself: change. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, Earth was warming consistently. And with that warmth came rivers where there had been snowpack, forests where there had been tundra, and, slowly, humans who began to stay. The end of the last ice age was not a clean break. It was a climatic stutter, a chaotic seesaw of warming and sudden cold snaps spanning millennia, finally stabilizing around 10,000 years ago. Across the globe, climate behaved differently, more erratically, less bound to glacial rhythms. This period, the late glacial, was one of profound ecological reorganization. Sea levels rose. Animals migrated. Vegetation exploded in places barren for generations. And somewhere in this cascade of thaw and renewal, our species, already spread to every continent except Antarctica, began to live differently. In the Levant, across modern Israel, Jordan, and Syria, archaeologists have uncovered traces of a culture poised on the edge of transformation. They are called the Natufians, and their remains span from about 14,500 to 11,500 years ago. They were still hunter-gatherers technically, but unlike the nomadic reindeer hunters of Ice Age Europe or the mobile foragers of Africa, Natufian groups built stone houses. They used heavy mortars and pestles to grind wild cereals. They returned to the same places year after year. They began to tie themselves to the land. This was not farming, but it was no longer constant roaming either. The ecological context is critical. As the ice melted, rainfall patterns shifted, river systems transformed, and the Levant blossomed into rich woodlands and grasslands. Wild barley, wheat, lentils, and chickpeas grew in abundance. Herds of gazelle and aurochs roamed nearby. With such concentrated bounty came the possibility, not yet the necessity, of staying put. This new semi-sedentary life brought innovation and challenge. The Natufians created microlithic tools for composite weapons, shaped flint sickle blades for harvesting wild grains, and fashioned intricate bone tools. They buried their dead in formal graves, sometimes with animal remains or ochre. They collected seashells from distant shores, suggesting trade or long-distance movement. At settlements like Ain Mala, they built circular stone houses, partially sunk into the ground, with thatched roofs and central hearths. These were not camps. They were homes. But this new relationship with place was fragile. Around 12,800 years ago, the climate reversed abruptly. The Younger Dryas event, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions, plunged parts of the northern hemisphere back into cold for over 1,000 years. For communities like the Natufians, this meant crisis. Many settlements were abandoned. Food sources dwindled. Bones from this period show signs of nutritional stress. In some regions, the gathering of wild plants intensified. Others may have begun small-scale cultivation, not as a conscious invention of agriculture, but as a desperate survival strategy. Whether the Younger Dryas was the final push or merely an interruption, what followed was unmistakable. After 10,000 years ago, the Earth entered the Holocene, the epoch we live in today. The climate stabilized. Forests matured. Rivers swelled into predictable cycles. And across parts of the Near East, humans didn't just return to their old ways. They went further. They began to plant seeds intentionally. They began to shape the landscape. They began to domesticate. But none of this was inevitable. The Natufians and their contemporaries were still children of the wild. They were not farmers. They were survivors in a world that kept shifting beneath their feet. What makes this period so compelling is its delicate balance between old and new, between movement and stillness, between gathering and the first faint idea of growing. This was a time when the notion of staying began to compete with the ancient instinct to roam. A time when the land began to shape the people as much as they had once shaped it with stone. And yet, with all this context, one question lingers. When the ice vanished and the green world returned, did the way we think change too? Not just our habits, but our minds. Did the predictable rhythm of seasons give rise to a more patterned, anticipatory consciousness? Did the return of abundance awaken a new kind of imagination? A vision of what could be, not just what was? We do not know. But the earth remembers. And the roots of that memory still wind through every field we sow and every home we build today. By the time the last glaciers had receded for good, something new was stirring, not just in the landscape, but in the minds moving across it. This was no longer quite the world of the big game hunters, and not yet the world of the farmers. But in between, there was a time when people did something quietly revolutionary. They adapted not to scarcity, but to abundance. This is the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. But beneath that simple label lies one of the most subtle cognitive shifts in human history. For millennia, survival had tracked the cold, the mammoth, the reindeer, the pressing need to keep moving. But with sustained warming came a different challenge. Things grew and kept growing. Forests filled in the open steppe. Lakes and rivers swelled and stabilized. Fish ran in predictable cycles. Herds moved differently. For the first time, humans had to rethink what it meant to hunt in a world that was no longer fleeing from them. So, we did what we've always done at our best. We experimented. We got smaller, subtler, and more precise. The stone tools of this period don't shout with size. They whisper with sophistication. Instead of massive hand axes, the Mesolithic gave us the microlith. Tiny, geometric flakes of flint or obsidian, crafted with precision and then set into slots along bone or wooden shafts like deadly puzzle pieces. These weren't tools of brute force. They were tools of selection, speed, and control. With microliths came the bow and arrow, not just to kill, but to choose your target. You could take a single deer without disturbing the herd. You could aim for a duck among the reeds or a salmon leaping upstream. The Mesolithic mind was tuned to discrimination. It was also the age of the net, the trap, and the hook. People stopped merely waiting for game to come to them and began to intercept the rhythms of the environment. They built woven fish traps in tidal estuaries, set snares along animal trails, and crafted barbed harpoons from antler. The first true fishhooks appear during this time, carved from bone or shell. These were not tools of desperation, but of profound patience, a kind of planning that had more to do with understanding cycles than confronting immediate risk. If the Paleolithic mind was tuned to the pulse of the herd, the Mesolithic mind was tuned to the turning of the tides. And in this new, rhythmic world, something extraordinary happened. We didn't just master other animals. We invited one into our circle. Somewhere between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago, in a forest clearing or near a settlement's edge, a few bold wolves made a choice. They lingered. They stayed close. And a few curious humans chose not to chase them off. What followed wasn't a contract or a plan. It was a slow, mutual entanglement that would reshape the destiny of both species. The earliest archaeological evidence of domesticated dogs dates to this Mesolithic horizon. Sites like Bonn-Oberkassel in Germany or Uyun al-Hammam in Jordan show dogs buried carefully alongside humans, treated not as meat or threat, but as companions. These early dogs weren't bred to herd livestock or pull sleds. Those economies didn't exist yet. They were partners in the hunt, scouts, sentries, and living sources of warmth. With a dog at your side, the forest at night feels less unknowable. You are no longer alone in your alertness. The dog became an extension of human perception, and somewhere in that shared watchfulness, a new emotion took root: interspecies trust. It was biological, practical, and it changed everything. We also began to move differently, not just walking, but floating. Mesolithic people built the first canoes, simple dugouts hollowed from tree trunks using controlled fire and stone adzes. We know this from rare, preserved finds like the Pes canoe in the Netherlands, dated to around 10,000 years ago. The proliferation of lake, river, and coastal sites implies regular movement by water. In regions like Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Baltic, human life clustered along these liquid highways. These weren't just camps, they were networks. Fishing intensified. Trade quickened. So did the flow of ideas. Because once you start using rivers as roads, concepts begin to travel faster than feet ever could. Tool styles diffused. Decorative objects appear far from their material sources. And while Mesolithic people remained largely mobile, something subtle was shifting. They started returning to the same places with reliable regularity. They cached food and tools. They modified landscapes. They timed their movements to the runs of fish and the cycles of plants. Here, archaeologists begin to speak of sedentism without agriculture. People not yet planting crops, but living as if they might one day want to. This is not the Neolithic, but it is a deep and patient rehearsal for it. And within this rehearsal, we see the dead treated with new permanence. Not always, not everywhere, but in some places under certain conditions, burial becomes more formal. Ochre stains the earth, antler tools are placed as grave goods, stone pendants accompany the body. This isn't necessarily organized religion, it's something quieter. It's the suggestion that individual lives mattered enough to mark their end, that memory could cling to a specific patch of earth even if the living community moved on. What does it take for a hunter-gatherer to invest labor in burying the dead? It's a cost. And it tells us that Mesolithic minds lived with a degree of stability and foresight that allowed for honoring absence, for structured grief. So what changed in us as the world warmed? We didn't build empires or write epics. But we began to live with rhythm rather than just chasing it. With returning salmon, loyal dogs, and familiar, fruit-bearing groves. We began to think in cycles and loops, not just straight-line pursuits. And in that looping, predictive world, invention thrived. No one drew a blueprint for the Mesolithic. But out of warmth, out of relative stillness, out of long afternoons by the water, humanity did something perhaps no other animal has done to the same degree. It began to practice. Not for war or worship, but for living. We were not yet domesticators, but we were getting close. We were not yet farmers, but we had largely stopped chasing. We were not yet wholly home, but we had ceased being perpetually lost. The Mesolithic mind isn't one that changed everything in a flash. It's one that waited, watched, and sharpened its focus. Not just the edge of the stone, but the very idea of what we might yet become. Because in the next world, just over the next season's hill, we wouldn't just find our food. We would try to grow it. And with that, the greatest and most dangerous experiment of all would begin. Why would a free species choose to plant itself in one place? For over 90% of our history, humans did not grow food. We found it, hunted it, fished it, gathered it. We move to where it was when it was. The idea of digging into the earth, putting a seed down and waiting, staying, is so recent, so counterintuitive, it feels like forgetting how to be human. And yet, sometime between 10,000 and 7,500 years before our common era, in the hills and river valleys of the ancient Near East, something shifted, and the earth began to grow a new kind of ape. The Fertile Crescent is not so much a place as an arc of memory written in green. Stretching from the highlands of southeastern Turkey, through the plains of Syria, and down along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the Zagros Mountains of Iran. Today it can seem arid, but then, the climate was gentler. A warm, moist period followed the ice, and the region swelled with wild grasses and pulses. Gazelles moved through in waves, and so did humans. And then, for reasons we're still piecing together, some of them stopped. Archaeology gives names to the first farmers, but they didn't start with farms. Before wheat, there was wild einkorn. Before plows, there were digging sticks. Before granaries, there were baskets and pits in the ground. And before all that, there was an act of profound noticing. At sites like Abu Huraira on the Euphrates, people had gathered wild grains for thousands of years. Then slowly the balance tipped. In the oldest layers, almost all seeds are wild. In the layers above, more and more show the signs of domestication, larger seeds, tougher stems that don't shatter. This wasn't done by magic or even by grand design, but by unconscious selection. The tallest, least shattering stalks were the ones conveniently gathered and later replanted. The humans did not intend to create wheat. The wheat, in a way, evolved humans. If there is a true beginning to the agricultural revolution, it is not a monument or a village. It is this shift in a selective partnership, a realignment of two species' survival logic. The grasses wanted to spread their seeds, the humans wanted to eat them. In the meeting of those desires, a new kind of dependency was built, a mutual trap of immense productivity. At Jerf el-Ahmar in Syria, a settlement dating to around 9000 BCE, we find stone houses with round, sunken floors and benches. One larger structure may have been a communal space, but nearby are buildings clearly used for grain storage. Grooves worn into basalt slabs speak of endless grinding. This was not just a place to eat food, it was a place to process it, to invest labor in its future. But what was the cost? Farming brings food surpluses, yes, but those surpluses come with chains. Fields must be defended. Crops must be harvested on a strict schedule. Pests and blights become catastrophic. Hunter-gatherers rarely had cavities. Early farmers, grinding carbohydrate-rich grains, often did. Their bones sometimes show signs of stress, anemia, and shorter stature. Calories went up, health did not always follow. Still, something else grew alongside the grain: permanence. When humans began farming, they began drawing tighter circles around themselves. Villages formed. Pathways became roads. More than food, they began to cultivate place. This didn't happen everywhere at once. Farming took centuries to spread. Many groups kept moving, but the idea was seeded now, and it would never fully go away. By 8000 BCE, farming communities dotted the Levant, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Wild barley and lentils became more uniform under human selection. Sheep and goats began to appear in managed numbers, a story of its own. What matters here is the new relationship with the land. No longer merely something to pass through, the earth became something to stay on, to measure, to fence, to rely upon, and perhaps, for the first time, to fear. Drought now meant famine. A bad harvest could echo for years. Concepts of land ownership, though nascent, hinted at future inequality. Hierarchies began to bud, and with them, competition. But here is the strange part. For all its monumental consequence, the agricultural revolution was not inevitable. For thousands of years, it was local, patchy, sometimes abandoned. In the highlands of Iran, people foraged long after their neighbors farmed. In some places, cultivation began without permanent houses. In others, people settled before they farmed. The sequence wasn't linear. It never is. So why do it? Perhaps because once it starts, farming has a gravitational pull. It supports more people, which creates pressure to sustain them, which demands more food, which means more land. Over generations, mobility becomes impossible, and what began as an experiment begins to feel like destiny. Even the tools transformed. Flint sickle blades mounted in handles appear. Grinding stones multiply. Mud brick structures grow in size and complexity. Storage pits deepen. The rhythms of daily life shifted from tracking animal movements to tracking seasons. And eventually, to tracking time itself. This is the hidden revolution, not the seed, but the schedule. The slow transformation of human life from responsive to predictive, from intuitive to planned. A mind that once navigated by stars and animal signs now began to count days, dig irrigation ditches, and prune branches. And somewhere in all this, the wildness within and around us began to thin. It never vanished. Forests remained, animals wandered, people still hunted, but something had tilted. The center of gravity was no longer the hunt. It was the harvest. The world would never be quite the same again. And yet, if we could ask one of those early villagers why they did it, why they traded freedom for grain, they might not speak of progress or the future. They might simply say, it worked. It fed the children. It kept us together through the winter. It gave us a reason to stay. But was it worth it? We're still deciding that. It started with a look, a sustained gaze across a clearing, a shared space over generations. Long before kingdoms, written words, or measured time, our ancestors began sharing their lives with animals. Not by sudden design, not all at once, and never entirely on our terms. Somewhere in the gradient between wild and tame, a pact was formed, one neither side fully understood, and it would reshape the destiny of both. By the 8th millennium BCE, humans had already begun to cultivate plants. But seeds, no matter how carefully tended, could not move. Animals could. And so, the next great Neolithic gamble began. Not putting life into the soil, but inviting it into the circle of the camp, and eventually, into the fabric of society. The first animals to cross this threshold were not random. Goats and sheep led, with pigs and cattle following. They were chosen not just because they were edible, though that certainly helped, but because they were flexible. Flexible in diet, in social structure, and critically, in their predisposition to follow. Herd animals already understood hierarchy. All humans had to do was insert themselves at its head. In the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, goat bones dating to around 8,500 BCE show a revealing pattern. Many males were killed young, while females lived longer. This doesn't happen in nature. It happens under management. Too many adult males cause conflict. Selective culling controls the herd. Similar clues appear across the Fertile Crescent. At sites like Zawi Kemi Shanidar and Ain Ghazal, sheep and pig bones reveal population profiles skewed toward juveniles, the hallmark of a controlled breeding strategy, not a wild harvest. Humans were now deciding not just when to kill, but when to let live and whom to breed. That is the heart of domestication. But domestication is more than taming. A tamed animal learns to tolerate humans. A domesticated one is genetically and physically altered by them over generations. Skulls shrink, ears may droop, coats change color, brains often become smaller. They grow less aggressive, more tolerant of crowding, more attuned to human cues. In short, they evolved to fit into our world. Goats became smaller and more manageable. Sheep grew woollier coats. Pigs became more compact and fertile. Cattle, though slower to domesticate, offered a staggering package: meat, milk, hide, and muscle for labor. This exchange, however, was not one-sided. We shaped the animals, but they reshaped us in return. The ability to digest milk into adulthood, for instance, is not a human universal. Most mammals lose the enzyme lactase after weaning. But in certain pastoral societies, a genetic mutation allowing lifelong lactose persistence spread rapidly. This was not natural selection in a vacuum. It was cultural evolution driving biological change, a clear case of gene-culture coevolution. We bred the cows, and the cows, in a very real sense, bred us back. Beyond biology, domestication changed our psychology. Herding demands a new kind of foresight, planning for grazing, water, protection, and breeding cycles. It pushed cognitive horizons further into the future. It also introduced a new, intimate relationship with violence. Predators now threatened not just your person, but your property, your winter food supply. Guarding, defending, and preemptive killing became ingrained economic necessities, planting seeds for territorialism and organized conflict. Perhaps the strangest consequence was emotional. For the first time, a species routinely raised animals from birth only to later kill them. This wasn't the detached risk of the hunt. This was the calculated care and then consumption of a known individual. This psychological tension likely gave rise to the first formalized rituals, burials of prized animals, symbolic deposits, perhaps even early myths to reconcile the act of nurturing with the necessity of slaughter. In many Neolithic sites, we see these dual impulses, careful butchery marks alongside ceremonial treatment of animal remains. The process itself remains shrouded in mystery. It likely began not in pens, but in gradients, semi-wild zones where certain opportunistic animals, pigs at the midden, goats attracted to salt, lingered near human camps. A feedback loop formed. Tolerance led to proximity, proximity to dependence, dependence to control. One day, the boundary between wild and managed simply faded away. By 6000 BCE, domesticated animals had spread far from their origins. Goats climbed the rocky slopes of the Mediterranean. Sheep grazed the cold steppes of Central Asia. Pigs rooted in the forests of China. Cattle were managed in both Africa and the Near East. This was no longer a local experiment. It was a planetary transformation. The biosphere itself was bending to human will. With it came a shift in worldview. Once you rely on an animal for survival, your perception of it changes. It is no longer just food or threat. It becomes resource, partner, symbol, even a reflection of the self. Domesticates appear in early art not as mere prey, but as potent icons, bulls carved in stone, goat motifs painted on plaster. Life now flowed through cycles of birth, growth, controlled breeding, and selective culling. A new order was being written in bone and wool and herd behavior. Still, not all animals crossed the threshold. Some resisted. Others we never tried. Domestication was a narrow gate, and only certain species possessed the right combination of biology and behavior to pass through. It was not destiny. It was a series of mutual choices, made by both humans and animals, that locked us together in a shared fate. So, who domesticated whom? The question lingers. In shaping another life form so profoundly, we inevitably reshaped our own society, economy, and even our souls. We changed their genes. They changed our story. And in that story lies a quiet, powerful truth. For most of history, humans shared the planet with creatures they did not control. Then, suddenly, a few were brought inside the circle, fed, bred, named, and sacrificed. That is where a certain kind of power begins. Not with a sword or a crown, but with a corral and a rope. What comes after you share your world with animals? What happens when your food not only stays in one place, but you build your containers to hold it, to cook it, to store it for seasons? That story is waiting in the next layer of time, written not in bone, but in fired clay. Somewhere between the damp forests of ancient Japan, the floodplains of China's Yellow River, and the rocky valleys of the Levant, a peculiar material began to take on a new life. Fragments of hardened clay, shaped not by river or wind, but by human hands, scorched and transformed by flame. These broken pieces belong to vessels that logic says shouldn't exist yet. Because this was a time before metal, before the wheel, before cities. And yet, someone was already shaping Earth into memory. For nearly 3 million years, humans used stone, bone, and wood. But clay was different. Soft, wet, pliable, yet catastrophically fragile when dry. It needed fire, but not just any fire. It needed a specific, controlled heat to harden it without destroying it. In this delicate balance, pottery was born. not in a single eureka moment, but through a slow, scattered dance of experiment and accident, spanning continents long before farming took root. And it may have begun not in the great centers we imagine, but at the edges, in fishing camps and forest clearings, beside small fires lit by people who had no word for permanent. The oldest known pottery in the world comes from Japan. At sites like Odai Yamamoto and Fukui Cave, small fragments appear as early as 16,000 years ago, with more recognizable Jaman pottery emerging between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago. These early pots are often simple, bag-shaped containers impressed with cord patterns, a cultural signature so enduring it named the period. The people who made them were not farmers. They were complex hunter-gatherers. In their damp, forested world, pottery was practical, for storing, boiling, and fermenting wild foods like fish, nuts, and tubers. Its utility lay in processing and preservation. A similar story unfolds in southern China, at Xianrending and Yucanyan caves, where pottery shards date to around 18,000 to 20,000 years ago. Again, made by foragers, likely used to cook wild plants and maybe even brew early fermented drinks. This appends an old assumption that pottery followed agriculture as a tool for storing grain. In many places, pottery came first. In the Middle East, pottery arrives later, around 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, within what's called the pre-pottery Neolithic. Here, in early villages with domesticated plants and animals, pottery emerges alongside sedentary life, quickly becoming central for cooking, storage, and ritual. Vessels are often round-bottomed for hearth cooking, sometimes decorated with paint or incisions. But wherever it appeared, pottery represented a new way of thinking about material. To make a pot, you don't just shape clay, you have to master fire. Between 600 and 800 degrees Celsius, clay undergoes a permanent metamorphosis. Its chemical structure changes. It becomes ceramic, and once fired, it cannot return to mud. Pottery is fragile, but it is also the first truly permanent, human-made material. In a world of perishable wood, hide, and fiber, this was a conceptual revolution. This permanence may be why pottery so quickly took on artistic and symbolic weight. Even early pieces are often decorated, with fingernail grooves, cord impressions, incised lines, as if to say, this is not just a container, it is an object that holds meaning. Later traditions, from the linear pottery culture in Europe to the Ubaid in Mesopotamia, would elevate this into a major artistic medium. Pottery also hints at social knowledge. In many prehistoric and traditional contexts, pottery making is associated with women, often linked to control of the hearth and food processing. The knowledge of clay sources, tempering materials, drying times, and firing techniques was likely passed down through generations, not in writing but through touch, observation, and practiced repetition. Pottery, then, may have been not just a technological leap, but a cultural thread connecting mothers to daughters, seasons to cycles, craft to identity. In this way, the birth of pottery might also be the birth of something quieter, the idea that shaping the world could be a personal, skilled, and enduring act. We think of innovation as a flash, a disruption. But pottery was a slow simmer, a convergence of observations scattered across the globe, emerging in parallel from Japan to Jordan. It was not one invention, but many. And in that, it mirrors prehistory itself, diffuse, fragmentary, and deeply, resonantly human. Some pots held grain, some held stew, some held water. Some may have held the bones of the dead or the hopes of the living. Some broke in the firing, some were used for decades, others were deliberately placed in the earth. Their fragments drifted into the archaeological record, waiting. And when we find them, we learn more than diet. We learn about control over temperature, about the desire for symmetry, about the human need to transform the mundane into something that can last. Pottery is not just technology. It is intention made durable. This brings us to the haunting question: why did so many different cultures, across such vast distances, invent this same fragile miracle? What were they really trying to preserve? Food or something else? Because in every pot, something of the maker remains. A fingerprint in the clay, a scorch mark from the fire, a trace of a pattern decided in a moment of creativity. And in every hearth where clay first hardened, there lingers the memory of someone who took earth in their hands and asked it to remember. What does it mean when humans begin to spin time itself? It's one thing to gather, to hunt, to shape stone or fire clay. It's another to capture the idea of circular motion, to spin a wheel not once, but indefinitely, to twist fibers into continuous thread, to weave a world from what you wear. These are not merely tools. They are metaphors made tangible. The spindle and the loom mark the moment we stopped merely reacting to the world and began rehearsing its inherent rhythms. And as strange as it sounds, neither invention sprang from kings or cities. They emerged quietly from the same Neolithic world of rivers, granaries, and herded goats. Sometime between 7,000 and 4,000 years BCE, in landscapes not yet etched by empire, something began to turn, and it never truly stopped. The wheel seems inevitable to us now, as if the moment a circle was conceived, transportation followed. But the record tells a different story. Humans used sledges, rollers, and skids long before the wheel. The earliest solid wooden wheels, like those found near Ljubljana in modern Slovenia, date to around 3,500 BC. They were heavy, two-plank discs fixed to a rotating axle, clumsy, revolutionary, and born from a world already familiar with circular motion in another context, the potter's wheel. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest depictions of wheels are not for carts, but for shaping vessels. The potter's wheel likely predated the cartwheel, suggesting the circle was first used not to move across land, but to mold it between one's hands. The wheel was literal, carved from timber, pulled by beasts. The loom, meanwhile, was something softer, more intimate. It took separate threads and made them into a continuous plane. The act of weaving is ancient. Impressions of woven fabric appear in clay from Upper Paleolithic sites over 25,000 years old. But the Neolithic changed its scale and purpose. Plant fibers like flax, hemp, and nettle were spun using drop spindles, elegant, simple tools that rarely survive except for their clay or stone whorls. By the 7th millennium BC in the Near East and Europe, loom weights begin to appear, implying the use of vertical warp-weighted looms. These were machines for turning thread into textile, into cloth. And what was cloth for? Well, of course, but also identity. Human clothing is never just protection. It is signal. Color, weave, and pattern denote belonging, status, or personal taste. In the Neolithic, dyed fibers, beads, and intricate weaves appear alongside grave goods. Some scholars suggest weaving, unlike flint knapping or later metalwork, was predominantly a female domain, a division of labor visible in burial assemblages and later iconography. The loom, then, was not just a machine. It was a mirror of the social fabric being woven alongside the linen. In Mesopotamia, early pictographic tablets record not only wheeled carts but also spinning and textile rations. This points to another transformation, the emergence of surplus as bureaucracy. To weave at scale meant not only to clothe, but to count, to allocate, to control. And so the wheel, first a turntable, then a cartwheel, and the loom, first a domestic craft, became tools of the early state, or the structures that would become one. But long before accounts and taxes, there was the human hand, twisting, pulling, rotating. Someone, somewhere, looked at a circle and wondered if it could turn. Someone else, perhaps by the dim light of a shelter, learned to pass thread over and under, warp and weft, not knowing this simple act of crossing would echo through every tapestry, every garment, every sail in history. These inventions are often termed technologies, but they are deeper. They are crystallized thought. The wheel is cyclical time. The loom is interconnected memory. The thread is the narrative that binds them. Picture a group of humans, no longer nomadic, seated by a dwelling they built. Flax dries nearby. A potter's wheel creaks, shaping a jar. A child watches thread twist onto a spindle. And for the first time in deep history, their clothing is not merely acquired. It is created, chosen. These were still people without bronze or written law. But they were beginning to structure time, to wear it, to move through it in a new way. Civilization doesn't arrive in a roar. Sometimes, it spins softly into existence. So the question lingers, was the wheel merely about movement, or was it about capturing the very concept of revolution? And when we learned to weave, were we binding fibers, or were we stitching together the future itself? Before anything spun, before fabric covered skin, humans were already weaving ideas. The memory of seasons, the path of a river, the arc of stars, even without physical looms, we were joining cause to effect, past to present. The instinct to take separate, slender things and combine them into something stronger and more enduring is ancient. Thread may have been our first true infrastructure. Long before roads or wires, a single spun strand represented connection, the joining of one moment to the next, one person to another. Archaeological remains of ancient cordage, made from plant fibers or sinew, stretch back tens of thousands of years. These early cords tied shelters, secured tools, bound memories. And as fibers grew longer, so did the human timeline. A piece of woven cloth isn't just practical, it is durable language. The will had to wait. It demanded more than a circle. It required pairing, symmetry, balance, and understanding of axial friction. Until the Neolithic, no one seems to have translated the circle into sustained, controlled rotation. But once realized, it unleashed an idea that could not be contained. The world no longer had to be carried, it could roll. And so, the first true circle became a rhythm, not like a planet's turn, but a human one, repetitive, controllable, mechanical. This recursiveness made the wheel radical. In a quiet corner of the same Neolithic landscape, a parallel circle emerged, the spindle whorl. While the cartwheel carried weight, the spindle carried intention. Both began as practical answers. Both became engines of permanence. There is a gentle, often overlooked genius to weaving, which may be why it changed us so profoundly. You don't announce fabric the way you announce a new weapon or a fire. It enters life softly. But once humans begin wrapping themselves in meaning, literal, wearable meaning, it becomes hard to distinguish where utility ends and story begins. The spindle, the loom, the dye pot, these were our first storytelling machines. And like all potent stories, they spread through contact and imitation. The knowledge of how to twist flax, how to carve a stable axle, how to tension a warp on a loom, none of this existed in a vacuum. Every technique required teaching. This necessitated the invention of instruction. Not writing, not yet, but demonstration, gesture, patience, practice. Showing a child how to spin thread without breaking it, or how to fit a spoke, that takes more than dexterity. It takes continuity across generations. So when we say civilization began to spin, perhaps it is not merely a metaphor. When did fire stop cooking food and start transforming stone? Somewhere in the heart of the Neolithic, between the 7th and 5th millennia BC, a few curious hands picked up an object far older than themselves. A greenish, heavy rock veined with red, smelling of the soil. This was native copper. And for the first time, someone didn't just admire it. They struck it. They bent it. They tried to change its very nature. Until this point, fire was a companion, warm, terrifying, useful. It cooked our meals, scared predators, lit our nights, and slowly became the social center of everything. But something shifted when people applied it not to food, but to materials. Not to survive, but to shape. What emerged was not a revolution, but a delicate edge, the very cusp of the Metal Age, a moment suspended between the world of stone and all that would follow, when stone was still sovereign, but other substances began whispering of possibility. Native copper was unlike anything in the natural toolkit. It didn't need complex chemistry to extract from, or it was already pure, already metal. Nuggets lay in some riverbeds, and its malleability was startling. Struck with stone, it dented rather than shattered. It behaved in a new way. Across parts of the Middle East, Southeast Europe, and Central Asia, this metal began appearing in human sites, not in abundance, but with growing curiosity. By the 6th millennium BC, small copper items, pins, beads, awls, start to emerge. These weren't tools for conquest or farming. They were slow, personal, experimental. Most were made by cold hammering, pounding the copper without heat. It's a simple idea, but it contained the seed of metallurgy. Hammer too much and copper hardens, becomes brittle. Heat it gently, and it softens again, a lesson that fire could reset a metal's properties. That lesson alone began a long, winding dialogue between human curiosity and the stubbornness of matter. What's striking is how long this exploratory phase lasted. For thousands of years, copper remained rare, ornamental, small-scale. This was not yet the age of furnaces. These early experiments were alchemy by accident, the result of minds testing limits. At sites like Catalhoyuk and Tel Magzalia, small hammered copper artifacts appear alongside flint blades and obsidian points. Stone still did the hard work. Copper was strange, almost ceremonial. It hadn't proven itself. In some regions, like the Iranian Plateau and the Balkans, we find tantalizing clues of early smelting, a few lumps of copper slag, pieces of or that seem intentionally heated. But even here, nothing was uniform. There was no single eureka moment. Just centuries of small failures and iterations, of people noticing residues in fire pits, that some stones could weep a strange, bright substance. What may have pushed this forward was the existing technology of pottery. Once people built kilns hot enough to fire clay, they were also generating temperatures high enough to alter certain ores. Not on purpose at first, but connections slowly formed. A piece of clay lining stained with metal, a fire pit with unexpectedly high temperatures. These clues suggest metallurgy didn't emerge from nothing. It was an extension of the technologies already in place for mastering other materials. Fire wasn't new. Containers weren't new. But their marriage began to produce results stone alone never could. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of this entire phase is its breathtaking slowness. From the first hammered copper bead to the first reliably smelted copper tool took not decades or centuries, but millennia. There was no urgent race, no arms drive. Just human beings living, observing, trying, failing, and trying again. And that tells us something profound. Innovation wasn't always born from desperate need. Sometimes, it was born from pure, patient wonder. In this long twilight of the Stone Age, we see humans not yet consumed by efficiency or empire, but poised between curiosity and necessity. Copper wasn't better than flint for cutting. It dulled faster, it bent. But it was beautiful. And that beauty mattered. Some of the earliest copper items are decorative rings, bracelets, markers of status. A few were buried with their owners. Others were cached like offerings. It's as if early humans sensed that copper wasn't just a new tool. It was a new category of being. And yet, the earth resisted. Most copper isn't native, it's locked inside rock. Extracting it would require not just fire, but control, bellows, contained vessels, precise timing, the chemistry of reduction. That chapter hadn't yet been written. So the edge of metal remained just that, an edge we approached with slow, cautious steps, unevenly across the globe. In many parts of the world, especially outside the Near East and Southeast Europe, the Neolithic continued for thousands of years without a whisper of copper. But where it did appear, it quietly transformed humanity's sense of material possibility. It suggested that stone wasn't the final word on matter. That transformation belonged not just to food or clay, but to the very bones of the earth. That the world could be unlocked, melted, and reimagined. In that realization, something else shifted. Not just in our tools, but in our minds. We began to see nature not merely as a setting, but as a set of systems that could be altered, reconfigured, mastered. The age of stone was still with us, but something inside it was beginning to glow. A glimmer that was not quite rock and not quite ash. The first shimmer of everything metallic, still half buried in clay, still muffled by the slow, patient pace of human hands. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing. The journey to metal didn't start with conquest or empire or weapons. It started with a child picking up a strange green stone and wondering, what else could this be? with someone watching a kiln's flame and noticing a streak of red where none should be, with a hammer striking copper not for utility, but for the sheer joy of seeing what would happen. And from that innate curiosity, everything else would follow. So if the Stone Age ever ended, it did not do so with a bang. Correct? It shimmered. It melted slowly. It whispered that something else was possible. And we listened. For hundreds of thousands of years, stone defined the human experience. Chipped, flaked, ground, and polished, tools of flint and obsidian had carved through bone and wood, hunted mammoth and hare, hollowed canoes, and harvested the first wild grains. Yet stone could not be bent. It could not be melted. It broke when struck wrong and dulled quickly under hard use. For all its utility, it obeyed the laws of fracture and gravity more than human will. But sometime after the 6th millennium BCE, a few observant minds noticed something peculiar. Among certain river gravels or at the foot of sun-baked hills, under layers of soil blackened by ancient hearths, there were stones that did not behave like stone. Some gleamed with a reddish or greenish tinge. Others could be shaped without shattering. And a few, when left too close to a fierce, sustained flame, began to weep a strange, bright substance. This was not stone. This was copper. And with its mastery began the slow, stumbling, almost accidental conclusion of the age defined by rock. No one knows the exact place where copper was first deliberately smelted. Unlike the dramatic finds of later ages, there is no singular tomb, no definitive archive. The record is hesitant, a scattering of clues, a blackened crucible fragment here, microscopic droplets of slag trapped in a hearth floor there. The earliest evidence for controlled smelting may come from the highlands of modern-day Serbia, at sites like Belivode and Plaknik, where remains of clay furnaces and traces of molten copper date to the 6th millennium BC. Meanwhile, in Iran's Zagros Mountains at Tal-i-Iblis, copper slags have been dated to around the 5th millennium BC. Similar, scattered evidence appears from the Indus region to the Levant, localized, unassuming, like the first faint glow of a dawn not yet visible on the horizon. To understand how strange this discovery must have been, remember what metal is. Unlike wood or stone, metal does not typically exist ready-made. Native copper is a geological rarity. Most metal is imprisoned within or a dull composite of rock and mineral, inert until subjected to the precise combination of high temperature and controlled atmosphere. You do not stumble into smelting by chance. You must be persistent, observant, and possess a fire far hotter than that of a cooking hearth. How did this happen? The answer may lie in the mastery of another material, pottery. By the early 5th millennium BCE, many Neolithic communities were skilled in building kilns, enclosed chambers that could channel air and sustain controlled, intense heat to fire clay. Once that technology existed, perhaps someone placed a piece of green malachite ore into a clay-lined pit, fed the fire for hours, and witnessed a miracle. The rock yielded a lump of solid, malleable copper. A new alchemy, born from the old craft of ceramics. But such miracles are rarely solitary. Once the technique was glimpsed, it spread not rapidly, but steadily along the slow channels of trade and kinship. Small copper items began to circulate: beads, pins, hooks, chisels. These were not mass-produced, nor did they replace stone. They were special. Their gleam carried a weight beyond function. In burials and hoards, copper objects seemed to signal prestige, a tangible rarity. At first, copper was too soft for felling trees or skinning hides, but it was novel, and in a world where materials were limited, novelty held power. Like the first woven textiles or the use of ochre, copper possessed an aura. This began to change as smelting became more understood. By the late 5th millennium BCE, cultures like the Vinca in southeastern Europe and the Tisapalgar in the Carpathian Basin were not just experimenting, they were producing. In the Balkans, workshop sites emerged with slag heaps meters thick, speaking of sustained, dedicated metallurgical activity. Similar traditions took root around the fringes of the Fertile Crescent, adapted to local ores and knowledge. Metallurgy was ceasing to be a curiosity. It was becoming a craft, a process governed by learned rules. The act of smelting itself demanded infrastructure. Crucibles, clay vessels capable of withstanding searing heat, had to be carefully formed and dried. Furnaces required insulation, often using broken pottery or ash. Charcoal, not just wood, was needed as fuel to reach the necessary temperatures. And someone had to work bellows, laboring in heat and smoke. This was not casual work. It was loud, grimy, exhausting alchemy. To obtain a handful of metal, you might need to process kilograms of rock. Failure was common. Ores were impure, crucibles cracked, the resulting metal was brittle. The first metallurgists were not wizards. They were tinkerers, experimentalists with soot on their hands and fire in their minds. Over time, they refined their craft. The copper became cleaner, more consistent. Tools graduated from the ornamental to the functional. Axes, blades, and adzes began to rival their stone counterparts. Not in raw cutting power, but in a crucial new property, recyclability. A broken copper tool could be melted and recast, a dull edge could be reworked. A stone tool, once broken, was merely a shard. Slowly, the supremacy of stone was being challenged not by war, but by a whisper, the whisper of metal cooling in a clay mold. Still, this was not yet the age of empires or standing armies. There were no large-scale bronze foundries, no complexes with scores of workers. The metallurgy of this era remained intimate, household scale, deeply dependent on local geology and generational know-how. It was a quiet, domestic revolution. In parts of southeastern Europe, archaeologists have found small copper ingots stored in the corners of homes, near loom weights or spindle whorls. This suggests metalworking was not yet a separate, specialized profession. The first smiths may have been fathers, mothers, weavers, or farmers for whom metallurgy was a seasonal or ritual skill, another thread in the fabric of daily life. Perhaps this is the true mystery, not that humans discovered how to turn rock into metal, but that they pursued it long before it was a necessity. Copper, at this stage, was not a superior weapon. It did not fundamentally change how people fed themselves or built shelters. Its emergence speaks less to urgent need and more to deep-seated imagination. It was not the strongest material available, but it was the most enchanting. And in the end, that allure may have been fuel enough. So we are left with a question: why did they keep at it? Why endure the smoke, the failures, the endless hours coaxing metal from stubborn stone, when flint was readily available and easier to work? Because something profound shifted when that first rivulet of molten copper flowed. The earth no longer yielded its gifts in finished form. Now we had to extract them, refine them, shape them through a marriage of violence and meticulous care. In doing so, humanity crossed a threshold, not merely technical but philosophical. For the first time, we were not just using nature. We were fundamentally transforming it, rewriting the rules of what matter could be and do. That shift, once initiated, would become irreversible. The Stone Age was ending, but it didn't know it yet. The ground held deeper secrets, and one of them, waiting in the combination of copper and tin, would soon usher in an age named for its alloy, bronze. Long before metal glowed in crucibles, humans had learned to coax transformation from the earth. Fire, pottery, pigments, each represented a small defiance of nature's given state. Clay could become stone-like, ash could become color, seeds could be encouraged into plenty. So perhaps the idea that stone itself could be made to weep and flow like water was not entirely unthinkable. What made metallurgy different was the mindset it required. This was no longer about finding what the world offered freely. It was about wresting something new from the heart of the old, turning hidden potential into tangible substance. In a sense, metal was the first material that didn't truly exist until we willed it into being. And yet, the earliest metallurgists didn't proclaim themselves as a new breed. They weren't revolutionaries. They were the same people living in the same houses, farming the same fields, weaving the same cloth. They simply spent more time near the hottest fires, near the riverbanks where unusual green stones gathered, and near the blackened pits where rock sometimes betrayed a secret shimmer. What they did may have looked like magic, but it was, at its core, repetition. Burned fingers and broken attempts. That is so often how true innovation begins, not with a flash of genius, but with stubborn, curious persistence. And so, slowly the process stabilized. Copper began to behave predictably. The first hammer marks gave way to the first clean pour from a crucible. Metallurgy evolved from a rare accident to a repeatable craft. It did not yet rule the world, but it was no longer a matter of mere chance. It had entered the human repertoire, one more profound way to change the world by understanding what lay hidden beneath its surface. That is where the story of early copper finds its pause. But it is also where something more consequential begins. The metal would not always be used for beauty. Soon it would be shaped to bite back. If you stood on the banks of the Tigris around 3000 BC, you might believe the Stone Age had finally passed. The glow of kilns, the scent of smelting, the sharp glint of new metal in freshly cast blades and chisels. These were the signatures of a world tilting toward a different order. Copper had been hammered, reshaped, and tested. Tin had been discovered. Bronze had begun its reign. And yet, for most of the Earth, the Stone Age did not end. Not that year. Not even that millennium. The phrase Stone Age implies a border, a line that can be crossed. But human cultures are not geological epics. They do not conclude everywhere in unison. They fracture, blend, persist. For every bronze spear in Mesopotamia, someone in the forests of Europe was still knapping flint. For every copper chisel in Anatolia, a person in the Andes was still carving with obsidian, not because they were behind, but because the mountains provided what they needed. The Stone Age, in truth, never vanished. It simply learned to live in parallel. Obsidian, volcanic glass, may be a stone, but in skilled hands it becomes something almost surgical. As early as 7,000 years ago in the Americas, obsidian flakes were shaped into blades capable of cuts cleaner than modern steel. In Ethiopia and Kenya, obsidian tools persist in the archaeological record from the Neolithic Rite into the Iron Age, not cast aside, but used alongside metal, chosen for their unparalleled edge and control. Even today, in high-precision surgery, instruments tipped with obsidian are sometimes employed where the cleanest incision is vital. That is not a relic, it is a cohabitation of technologies across time. In Japan, flint knapping continued into the historic period, long after bronze and iron had spread. In Australia, many Aboriginal groups crafted stone tools into the modern era, for ceremony and for function, because in specific contexts, stone remained the optimal choice. Across the Arctic, the Inuit perfected tools of bone and stone that functioned flawlessly in a frozen world where metal could become brittle and treacherous. The Stone Age did not die, it specialized. It adapted. Even within so-called advanced societies, stone retained a powerful, symbolic pull. Consider the cornerstone, not the copper stone or the bronze stone. We still commemorate permanence by placing a shaped piece of earth into our foundations. We speak of something being set in stone. When we wish to signify the timeless, we do not cast it in metal, we carve it from bedrock. Modern flint knappers, from archaeologists to hobbyists, have revived the techniques of Clovis point manufacture, of Levallois core preparation, of pressure flaking obsidian. These are not mere reenactments. They are acts of remembering. Because the Stone Age, far from a primitive void, was an epic of profound material genius, of skills honed over hundreds of thousands of years. Those skills were never truly lost. They were stored, like seeds beneath the ash. And in some places, they were never buried at all. On the island of New Guinea, stone tools were actively used in farming and construction into the 20th century, shaped by hands that had never ceased to know how. In the highlands, people used stone axes not because they had never seen metal, but because stone worked. It was strong, local, and intimately understood. So when we speak of the end of the Stone Age, we are really speaking of a shift in primary materials that unfolded unevenly, acknowledged in some places, ignored in others. Some valleys lit up with the shimmer of molten copper. Others remained in a different kind of light, echoing with the precise strike of flint, the shaping of quartzite, the whisper of a keen edge against wood. Even now, we carry those echoes. Every person who has ever struck a spark from flint, chipped a piece of glass to make a cut, or felt the satisfying fracture of a stone understands something ancient. They are touching a foundation older than kings, cities, or writing. They are living proof that the Stone Age is not a forgotten past. It is a layer folded deep within us. What other chapter of our story lasted so long? For over 3 million years, humans and our ancestors survived, adapted, and even thrived in a world shaped by stone, bone, sinew, and flame. For 99% of our existence, we were stone workers. And even in a world of satellites and silicon, that memory clings to us like the dust of old continents. So perhaps the Stone Age never truly ended. Perhaps it simply grew quieter, buried not in the ground, but under strata of language, complex tools, and our own assumptions. But it is still there. It's in every obsidian scalpel in a sterile kit. In every fragment of rock art that has outlasted the civilization that created it. In the resonant tink of a flint knapper's strike echoing across an archaeological field school. In the profound knowledge that even without engines, without electricity, without anything but mindful hands and patient thought, humans learned to shape their world. The question is not when the Stone Age ended. The question is how much of it we still carry, quietly, in our bones. Even in our most digital moments, some of us still nap. Some of us still shape stone, not from necessity, but from reverence. From a quiet longing to feel what it felt like to hold time itself in the palm of your hand. At gatherings across the world, people strike cores with antler billets, pressure flake glass with copper tools, trying to remember the invention of form from fracture. They are memory keepers. Because every tool we've ever fashioned still holds the ghost of the first one. Not a spirit, but a physics. A knowing. Even our synthetic glass, when cooled just so, cuts with the same perfection as ancient obsidian. In an emergency room, when a surgeon needs an edge finer than steel can provide, a sliver of volcanic rock, shaped in silence just as it was 50,000 years ago, might be the instrument that saves a life. In a universe of quantum computers, the edge that heals can still be born in fire and flaked by a human hand. The Stone Age did not vanish from the calendar. It settled into our metaphors, our muscle memory, our very idea of what is durable and real. We still measure our journeys with stones, stepping stones, milestones, gravestones. The stone marks where something began, where it ended, or where it simply mattered. In that sense, every stone tool ever made was not a primitive object. It was a sentence, patiently chipped into the deep time of a species learning how to last. So perhaps the Stone Age ended on a timeline in a textbook. But it never ended in us. Thank you for wandering this long path with Sleepy Owl. Thank you for drifting into deep time, for slowing down, for remembering with us. If this story helped you unwind, helped you focus, or simply offered a quiet space to breathe, we're glad you were here. If you think more people should hear these ancient whispers, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with another curious mind. Tell us, are you listening in the deep quiet of night, or during the quiet focus of your day? We'd love to know. And as always, wherever you are, however you listen, stay curious, stay calm. We'll see you in the next story.